John F. Kennedy, An Unfinished Life. Dark beginning, the weight of privilege. The morning sun breaks warm across Texas on November 22, 1963. The sky stretches blue and cloudless over Dallas, the kind of perfect autumn day that makes you believe in possibility. Along the motorcade route, crowds gather 10 and 15 deep, pressing against barriers, craning for a glimpse of the young president and his elegant wife. Children perch on their fathers' shoulders, women hold up signs, men wave American flags. The excitement ripples through the streets like electricity, the air charged with that particular energy that only comes when history passes close enough to touch. The presidential limousine turns onto Houston Street, then makes a slow left turn onto Elm, passing the red brick Texas School Book Depository. Inside the car, President John Fitzgerald Kennedy sits in the back seat, his wife Jacqueline beside him in her pink Chanel suit and matching pillbox hat. Texas Governor John Connally and his wife Nellie occupy the jump seats ahead of them. The bubble top is down. Security advised against it, but Kennedy insisted. He wants the people to see him, wants to connect with them directly, without barriers of glass and steel between a president and the citizens he serves. At 12:30 in the afternoon, as the motorcade glides through Dealey Plaza, the sound of gunfire shatters the Texas afternoon. What happens next unfolds in terrible slow motion, each second stretching into eternity as the impossible becomes real. The president is struck. Governor Connally cries out. Jacqueline Kennedy reaches toward her husband. The limousine accelerates toward Parkland Memorial Hospital, Secret Service agents throwing themselves across the wounded. But some wounds are beyond any medicine, any protection, any amount of wanting things to be different than they are. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, in Trauma Room 1 at Parkland Hospital, President John Fitzgerald Kennedy is pronounced dead. He is 46 years old. He has been president for 1,036 days. The youngest man ever elected to the office has become the youngest president to die in it. In the hallway outside, his wife stands in her blood-stained suit, refusing to change, refusing to let the world forget what has been done. "Let them see what they have done," she says, and those words carry the weight of a nation's shattered innocence. But this is not where the story begins. To understand what America lost that November day, you must go back to where it all started, to a modest house on a tree-lined street in Brookline, Massachusetts, where 46 years earlier, on May 29, 1917, a second son was born into a family that would come to define American political dynasty. The world into which John Fitzgerald Kennedy arrived was one at war. World War I raged across Europe, claiming millions of lives in trenches and battlefields whose names would become synonyms for slaughter. The United States had entered the conflict just weeks before his birth, and the front page of the Boston Globe on that spring day carried a message from aging Civil War veterans to a new generation. "We carried the flag then, you carry it now." The young infant, wrapped in blankets in his mother's arms, could not know that he would one day carry that flag in ways his parents could never imagine, that his generation would face challenges that would make their ancestors' trials seem almost comprehensible by comparison. Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy, disciplined and devout, made a careful notation on an index card for her second child. She kept such cards for all her children, 9 in total, documenting everything from doctor visits to shoe sizes with meticulous precision. "John Fitzgerald Kennedy," she wrote, born at 83 Beale Street, Brookline, Massachusetts. The family called him Jack, a blue-eyed baby who would grow into a second son in a family where second meant you lived in someone else's shadow. His father, Joseph Patrick Kennedy, was a man driven by ambitions that dwarfed ordinary dreams. The son of a Boston saloon owner, Joseph had clawed his way from Irish Catholic immigrant roots to Harvard, then into banking, bootlegging during Prohibition, shipbuilding, Hollywood, and Wall Street. He made millions, then tens of millions, establishing trust funds that would guarantee his children lifelong financial independence. Money was never the goal in itself, but rather the means to something greater: power, influence, and most of all, acceptance into a world that had posted signs reading, "No Irish need apply." Joseph Kennedy had married Rose Fitzgerald, daughter of John Francis "Honey" Fitzgerald, the colourful mayor of Boston. Politics ran in the family's blood like an inherited trait, passed down through generations who understood that in America, if you were willing to fight for it, power could be seized rather than merely inherited. The Kennedys and Fitzgeralds had long been shut out of Boston's Protestant elite society, barred from the country clubs and social circles that old money guarded jealously. Joseph Kennedy determined that his children would break through those barriers, that Kennedy children would not only equal but surpass the Cabots and Lowells and Lodges who had looked down on Irish Catholics for generations. The family that young Jack Kennedy grew up in was defined by fierce competition and impossible expectations. At the dinner table, Joseph Kennedy encouraged debate, demanded that his children discuss politics and current events, insisted they read widely and think critically. Business matters were never discussed at home, but politics consumed their conversations. The Kennedy children competed against each other in everything from swimming races to sailing competitions to football games on the lawn of their summer home in Hyannisport. When one child won, the others were expected to try harder, do better, never accept defeat. Family loyalty was absolute and unquestioned. But within the family, competition was relentless. For Jack, this meant living perpetually in the shadow of his older brother, Joe Jr. Handsome, outgoing, athletic, and confident, Joe Jr. was everything their father wanted in a firstborn son. He excelled at studies, dominated in sports, and possessed the kind of natural charisma that drew people to him. Their father made it clear that Joe Jr. was destined for greatness, that someday he would be the first Irish Catholic president of the United States. Jack, by contrast, was the spare, the backup plan, the second son who would support his brother's political career but never lead it himself. Missionary was sick. From his earliest days, illness stalked him like a patient predator. At age 2, he nearly died from scarlet fever, his small body racked with fever so high that the family priest came to administer last rites. He survived, but it was the first of many close calls. Throughout his childhood, Jack suffered from whooping cough, measles, chickenpox, and mysterious ailments that doctors could not properly diagnose. He was thin and sickly, where his brother was robust and healthy, bookish, where Joe Jr. was athletic, quiet, where his brother was commanding. Records of Jack's illnesses on her index cards, a chronicle of childhood diseases that read like a medical textbook. The family moved from Brookline to the Riverdale section of New York in 1927, partly because of Joseph Kennedy's business interests and partly to escape a polio outbreak in Massachusetts. They spent summers at Hyannisport, where the Kennedy children swam and sailed and played the legendary touch football games that would later become part of the family mythology. But for Jack, even these activities came with the constant awareness that his body could betray him at any moment, that he would never match his brother's physical prowess, no matter how hard he tried. At the Choate School, an elite preparatory academy, Jack's academic performance matched his physical condition: mediocre. He was bright enough, with a keen intelligence and gift for creative wit, but he chafed under authority and suffered from what his teachers politely called academic disinterest. He became a magnet for troublemakers, organizing pranks and schemes that drove the faculty to distraction. His room was consistently untidy, his grades consistently average, and his father worried that Jack would never reach his potential, never amount to anything more than a charming ne'er-do-well living off the family fortune. But beneath the surface of this privileged, sickly second son, something else was forming. Jack read voraciously, consuming books on history and politics with genuine passion, even as he ignored his assigned homework. He possessed a sharp, analytical mind, and the ability to see through pretense and pomposity. He developed a self-deprecating sense of humor that would serve him well throughout his life, learning to deflect with wit rather than confront with anger. And perhaps most importantly, he began to understand that being underestimated could be an advantage, that people who expected nothing from you could be surprised when you delivered something remarkable. Constrained of privilege bore down on young Jack Kennedy from every direction. He had money, but not health. Family connections, but not his own identity. A brilliant future laid out for him by his father, but one that belonged to his older brother. He was a Kennedy, which meant opportunity and expectation in equal measure. He was Irish Catholic, in an America that still viewed such heritage with suspicion. He was wealthy, in a time when the Great Depression devastated millions. He was being groomed for something, though what that something was remained unclear. Flooring. As Jack Kennedy moved through his teenage years and into young adulthood, the constant physical pain and the crushing expectations began to forge something unexpected: resilience. Each illness he survived made him stronger in ways that had nothing to do with physical strength. Each time he lived in Joe Jr.'s shadow, he learned to see things from angles his brother never considered. Each failure and disappointment taught him that setbacks were temporary, that persistence mattered more than perfection. The privileged second son was learning lessons that would one day make him a leader, though neither he nor anyone else could have predicted the path his life would take. The dark beginning held seeds of greatness that no one yet recognized. The sickly boy would become a war hero. The mediocre student would write best-selling books. The second son would surpass his destined brother. And the young man who seemed to drift through life with more style than substance would one day inspire a generation to ask not what their country could do for them, but what they could do for their country. But all of that lay ahead, beyond a horizon he could not yet see, waiting for him in a future that would be shaped by war, courage, and the terrible price of leadership. A body rebelling. If privilege was the weight John Kennedy carried on his shoulders, illness was the burden he carried in his bones. While other young men his age worried about grades and girls and games, Jack Kennedy fought a daily war against a body that seemed determined to destroy him from within. The constant battle with sickness shaped him in ways that health never could, teaching him that courage is not the absence of fear or pain, but the decision to move forward despite both. After graduating from Choate in 1935, Jack attempted to follow his brother Joe to Harvard, but first tried a semester at Princeton. The experiment lasted only weeks before illness forced him to withdraw and return home. It was a pattern that would repeat itself throughout his early life: ambition curtailed by a body that refused to cooperate, dreams delayed by doctors and hospital stays, and mysterious symptoms that baffled medical science. For most young men of his generation, physical weakness would have been a source of shame. But Jack learned to wear his vulnerability like armor, making jokes about his health before others could, controlling the narrative of his own suffering. When he finally entered Harvard in 1936, Jack's academic career there mirrored his time at Choate. He excelled in subjects that interested him, particularly English and history, but remained an indifferent student overall. His room was a disaster, his social life active, his grades unremarkable. He made the freshman football team through sheer determination rather than any natural athletic ability, playing with a ferocity that his scrawny physique did not suggest. During one game, he injured his back, an injury that would plague him for the rest of his life, compounding all his other ailments into a symphony of chronic pain that no amount of medicine could fully silence. But something began to shift during Jack's time at Harvard. In 1938, his father was appointed by President Franklin Roosevelt to serve as United States ambassador to the Court of St. James, making Joseph Kennedy one of the most powerful Irish Catholics in American history. Jack spent several months in London that year, serving as his father's secretary, and for the first time in his life, he began to take a serious interest in international politics. Europe stood on the brink of war, and from his privileged vantage point in London, Jack watched as British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain pursued his policy of appeasement toward Adolf Hitler's Nazi Germany. Young Kennedy traveled extensively through Europe during this period, visiting France, Poland, Latvia, Turkey, Palestine, Russia, and Germany. He wrote long, detailed letters to his father, analyzing the political situation with insight that surprised even Joseph Kennedy. The sickly young man who had drifted through prep school suddenly displayed a sophisticated understanding of geopolitics, recognizing patterns and connections that escaped many older and more experienced observers. He saw firsthand how Hitler's aggression tested the resolve of democratic nations, how appeasement emboldened dictators rather than satisfying them, how the choices of leaders in one year could lead to catastrophe in the next. These observations formed the basis of Jack's senior thesis at Harvard, which examined why England had been so unprepared for war with Nazi Germany. The thesis, titled Appeasement at Munich, demonstrated a level of analysis and insight that none of his professors had expected from the student with mediocre grades. Joseph Kennedy recognized the quality of the work and used his connections to get it published as a book. Why England Slept became a bestseller, establishing Jack Kennedy at age 23 as a serious thinker on international affairs. Critics praised the book's balanced approach and sophisticated analysis, though they could not have known that its author had written much of it while battling the chronic illnesses that made concentration difficult and rest impossible. Brightness graduated from Harvard cum laude in 1940, but the honor meant less to him than the personal satisfaction of having finally produced something of genuine merit, something that was his own, rather than something reflected from his brother's achievements. Joe Jr. had been the Harvard star, the athlete and scholar who made their father proud. Now Jack had his own accomplishment, his own identity, separate from being simply Joe Kennedy's other son. But the world was changing in ways that would soon make Harvard honors and published books seem quaint and irrelevant. By 1941, World War II raged across Europe and Asia. Hitler's forces had conquered most of continental Europe. Britain stood alone, enduring nightly bombing raids, while Winston Churchill rallied his people with speeches about fighting on beaches and never surrendering. In the Pacific, Imperial Japan pursued its campaign of conquest across China and Southeast Asia. The United States remained officially neutral, but everyone understood that neutrality could not last, that America would inevitably be drawn into a conflict that threatened to reshape the entire world. Jack Kennedy wanted to serve. Despite his catalogue of health problems, despite medical records that should have disqualified him from any military service, he was determined to get into the fight. His first attempts met with predictable rejection. The Army turned him down because of his back problems. The Navy rejected him for the same reason. For most young men, this would have been the end of the story. But Jack Kennedy was not most young men. He had connections, and he used them without shame or apology. His father intervened, pulling strings and calling in favors, and suddenly the Navy found Jack Kennedy acceptable for service. He underwent surgery on his back to make himself more fit for duty, enduring pain that would have broken weaker men. He worked out obsessively, building up his thin frame, forcing his rebellious body to meet the military's physical standards through sheer willpower. In September 1941, he was commissioned as an ensign in the Naval Reserve. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, pulling America into the war, Jack Kennedy was ready to fight. The Navy assigned him initially to desk duty in Washington, pushing papers and preparing intelligence reports, work that was important but safe. Jack chafed at the assignment. He had not fought his way into military service to sit behind a desk while other men his age fought and died. He wanted combat, wanted to prove himself in ways that had nothing to do with his family name or connections. He petitioned for assignment to motor torpedo boat training, the dangerous and glamorous PT boats that operated in the most hazardous waters of the Pacific Theater. PT boats were small, fast, and deadly, 70-foot wooden vessels armed with torpedoes and machine guns, designed to attack enemy ships with hit-and-run tactics before disappearing into the darkness. They were called plywood derbies and floating coffins by the men who served on them, boats that could be destroyed by a single well-placed shell or set aflame by their own high-octane fuel. The casualty rates for PT boat crews were among the highest in the Navy, but for Jack Kennedy, that was precisely the point. He wanted to test himself in combat, wanted to discover what kind of man he was when everything was on the line. Communicator PT boat training in Rhode Island in December 1942 with very high marks, and was asked to stay on as an instructor. But teaching was not fighting, so Jack pulled more strings, contacted more influential friends, and got himself assigned to Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 14 in the Panama Canal Zone. Still not satisfied, he used a family friend, Massachusetts Senator David Walsh, to divert his assignment and get him sent instead to the Solomon Islands, where American forces were engaged in desperate combat with the Japanese Empire for control of the Pacific. By April 1943, Lieutenant Junior Grade John F. Kennedy had arrived in the war zone he had fought so hard to reach. Throughout all of this, his body continued its rebellion. The tropical heat and humidity of the Pacific aggravated all his conditions. The malaria he contracted would recur for the rest of his life, causing fevers and weakness at unpredictable intervals. His back pain never subsided, made worse by the physical demands of handling small boats in rough seas. He likely suffered from what would later be diagnosed as Addison's disease, a potentially fatal disorder of the adrenal glands that caused weakness, weight loss, digestive problems, and vulnerability to infection. But Jack had learned long ago to compartmentalize pain, to function despite it, to never let others see weakness. His crew would remember him as energetic and engaged, with no idea that their young commander spent his nights unable to sleep because of the constant ache in his spine, the fever in his blood, the exhaustion that no amount of rest could cure. The body that had betrayed John Kennedy his entire life had taught him lessons that the healthy never learn. Pain makes you understand suffering in others. Illness shows you that life is fragile and temporary. Constant physical struggle develops a kind of mental toughness that cannot be learned any other way. The sickly second son had forged himself into something harder than steel through decades of fighting battles no one else could see. He did not know it yet, but these lessons would make him the kind of leader who could stand firm when the world teetered on the edge of nuclear annihilation, who could inspire hope when circumstances demanded despair, who could face death with grace because he had been making its acquaintance since he was 2 years old. His body was rebelling, and it always would be. But John Kennedy had learned to turn weakness into strength, to transform suffering into wisdom, to become more than the sum of his physical limitations. The war would test him in ways he could not imagine, would push him beyond every boundary of endurance and courage. And when that test came, on a moonless night in the Solomon Islands, the sickly young man would discover reserves of strength he never knew he possessed, would save lives when saving his own seemed impossible. The body might rebel, but the spirit could still triumph. The spark. From scholar to warrior. Transformation of John Kennedy from privileged Harvard graduate to combat-hardened warrior did not happen overnight, but rather through a series of experiences that progressively stripped away the comfortable assumptions of youth and replaced them with a harder, clearer understanding of the world and his place in it. The spark that would eventually ignite his political career was forged in Europe's darkening shadow and tempered in the crucible of war, shaped by the terrible knowledge that civilizations can crumble and democracies can fall when good men fail to act. Synagogue and Summer of 1938 marked a turning point in Jack Kennedy's intellectual development. While serving as his father's secretary in London, he had a front-row seat to one of history's most critical moments. Ambassador Joseph Kennedy had his own views about the approaching war, believing that Britain could not withstand Nazi Germany and that American involvement would be futile and costly. But his son Jack observed events with different eyes, younger eyes, not yet convinced that defeat was inevitable or that democracies had no choice but to bow before dictators. Jack traveled to Germany and witnessed the Nazi rallies firsthand, saw the torch-lit processions and the raised arms and the ecstatic crowds worshipping a leader who promised to make Germany great again through conquest and subjugation. He saw the fear in the eyes of German Jews, the swagger of brown-shirted thugs, the militarization of an entire society bent on war. In France, he observed a nation exhausted by the previous war, desperate to avoid another, willing to believe that appeasement could preserve peace, even as Hitler's territorial demands grew ever more aggressive. In Poland, he saw a nation caught between two hostile powers, Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia, knowing that war was coming, but unable to prevent it. Provoked. When British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returned from Munich in September 1938, waving a piece of paper and declaring, "Peace for our time," young Kennedy understood what many older and supposedly wiser men did not, that the agreement was not peace, but merely a postponement of war, purchased at the price of Czechoslovakia's freedom and paid for by the betrayal of democratic principles. Chamberlain's appeasement gave Hitler the industrial heartland of Central Europe, strengthened Germany for the war everyone knew was coming, and proved to the dictator that democracies lacked the will to resist. Preschool observations became the foundation for Jack's Harvard senior thesis. Working through chronic illness and the distractions of a busy social life, he produced a work of remarkable sophistication and insight. Why England Slept examined the political, economic, and social factors that had led Britain to pursue appeasement despite the obvious danger of Nazi aggression. Kennedy argued that democracies faced inherent disadvantages when competing with totalitarian states, which could mobilize resources and suppress dissent in ways that free societies could not. But he also argued that these disadvantages could be overcome through leadership, through the willingness to confront hard truths and make difficult choices before crisis became catastrophe. The book succeeded not because it placed blame or offered simple answers, but because it recognized complexity. Kennedy understood that Chamberlain and his colleagues were not cowards or fools, but rather men trapped by the economic constraints of the Great Depression, the pacifist sentiment of a population traumatized by World War I, and the democratic necessity of building public consensus before taking action. He showed how these factors combined to paralyze British policy, allowing Hitler to grow stronger while Britain remained militarily unprepared. The analysis was balanced and thoughtful, avoiding the easy moralizing that characterized most commentary on the Munich crisis. Kennedy, his father, arranged for publication. Why England Slept became a bestseller in America, selling 80,000 copies and establishing Jack Kennedy as a serious voice on foreign policy. Reviews were overwhelmingly positive, with critics praising the young author's clear prose and sophisticated analysis. At 23 years old, Jack had accomplished something entirely his own, separate from his brother's achievements or his father's influence. The book represented the spark of intellectual fire that had been smoldering inside him throughout his apparently aimless youth. The indication that beneath the charming exterior lived a mind capable of grappling with history's largest questions. But intellectual analysis of war is very different from experiencing it, and the gap between understanding conflict theoretically and surviving it personally was one that Jack Kennedy would have to cross in the most direct way possible. By 1941, the war that Why England Slept had analyzed was consuming the world. Hitler's forces had conquered France, driven British forces from continental Europe, and launched an invasion of the Soviet Union that seemed unstoppable. In the Pacific, Japan's military had seized much of China and was moving south toward the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia. The United States maintained official neutrality, but informed observers understood that neutrality could not last. Discharged, for the Kennedy family, December 7, 1941, changed everything, just as it changed everything for all Americans. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor killed more than 2,000 American servicemen, destroyed much of the Pacific Fleet, and made isolation impossible. The next day, President Roosevelt asked Congress to declare war on Japan, and within days, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. The global conflict that Jack Kennedy had studied and written about now demanded his personal participation. The Navy initially assigned Lieutenant Kennedy to desk work, Washington, preparing intelligence summaries and briefing senior officers. For a young man who had fought to get into the service despite his medical disqualifications, office work felt like failure. He had not manipulated his way past military doctors in order to push papers while other men fought. The Navy, with its rigid hierarchies and conservative instincts, was content to keep the ambassador's son safely behind a desk where his connections could be useful and his father would not have to worry about his fragile health endangering a combat unit. But Jack Kennedy had learned from his father that connections existed to be used, and he used them ruthlessly to secure assignment to PT boat training. The motor torpedo boat service represented the Navy's most glamorous and dangerous branch, small wooden boats that attacked enemy ships under cover of darkness, operating independently with minimal supervision. PT boat crews developed a reputation as mavericks and individualists, sailors who preferred action to protocol, men who volunteered for danger rather than having it assigned to them. It was exactly the kind of service that appealed to Kennedy's temperament, combining independence with action, risk with purpose. Pennsylvania from PT boat training in December 1942 with honors and was offered a position as an instructor. Most men would have accepted gratefully, recognizing that teaching others to fight was honorable service that did not risk life or limb. But teaching was still not fighting, and Jack Kennedy had not come this far to settle for safety. Through more string-pulling and favor-calling, he got himself assigned first to Panama, then managed to redirect that assignment to the Solomon Islands, where American forces were engaged in brutal combat with Japanese troops for control of strategically vital islands. The spark that had been ignited in the libraries and lecture halls of Harvard, that had been fed by his observations of pre-war Europe, that had driven him to write Why England Slept, and to fight his way into military service despite his physical limitations, was about to be tested in the most direct and unforgiving way imaginable. The scholar was becoming a warrior, not through any romantic notion of glory, but because he understood what was at stake. This was not a war of territorial disputes or economic competition, but a genuine fight between freedom and tyranny, between the possibility of human dignity and the certainty of human subjugation. Jack Kennedy believed in democracy not as an abstraction, but as a concrete reality worth defending. He had seen what happened when democracies failed to act, when good men convinced themselves that accommodation with evil was preferable to confrontation. He had watched Hitler devour Europe piece by piece, while democratic leaders searched for excuses to avoid conflict. He understood viscerally what many Americans still struggled to grasp, that this war would determine whether free societies could survive in a world where totalitarian powers had learned to harness modern technology and mass organization for conquest. As Lieutenant Kennedy shipped out to the South Pacific in April 1943, he carried with him a clarity of purpose that many of his fellow officers lacked. This was not a war to be endured, but a cause to be embraced. Democracy was not inevitable or permanent, but fragile and precious, requiring each generation to defend it anew. The privileged second son had found his calling not in the shadow of his older brother's destined greatness, but in the fire of a global conflict that demanded courage from all who understood what was being fought for. The spark had been struck. Now it would be tested in ways that no amount of intellectual preparation could anticipate, in circumstances where theory met brutal reality, where the comfort of analysis gave way to the immediacy of survival. The boy who had been too sick to play football, too fragile to serve, too overshadowed to shine, was about to discover what he was truly made of when everything else was stripped away. The scholar had become a warrior, and the warrior was sailing toward a moment that would define the rest of his life. Baptism by fire. The Solomon Islands, in the summer of 1943, were a green hell of jungle, heat, disease, and death. American forces had been fighting for control of these scattered volcanic islands since August 1942, when Marines landed on Guadalcanal and began the long, bloody campaign to push Japanese forces back toward their home islands. Every foot of ground was contested, every island a battlefield, every night filled with the sound of distant guns and the closer sounds of men dying in darkness. This was where Lieutenant John F. Kennedy would discover what kind of man he really was. PT Squadron 2 operated out of Rendova Island, a small base carved from jungle where mosquitoes carried malaria and the heat was so oppressive that moving felt like swimming through thick water. The motor torpedo boats berthed in Rendova Harbor were cramped, uncomfortable, and dangerous. 70-foot Elco-built craft with powerful engines, 4 torpedo tubes, and machine guns mounted forward and aft. Their mission was to intercept the Tokyo Express, the Japanese supply convoys that ran at night to deliver troops and supplies to Japanese garrisons in the northern Solomon Islands. It was hazardous duty, small boats against destroyers and cruisers in the darkness, attacking and withdrawing before enemy guns could find their range. Kennedy took command of PT-109 in April 1943. The boat had been through hard service, and her crew reflected that experience. Most were young men from small towns and cities across America, kids really, aged 20 to 25, who had volunteered for this dangerous service for reasons they could barely articulate even to themselves. Some sought adventure, others wanted to escape boredom. A few felt the pull of duty and patriotism. But whatever brought them to Rendova, they all shared the knowledge that they were doing something that mattered, that the war would be won or lost by men like them in places like this, far from home and far from anyone who would remember their names if things went wrong. The crew of PT-109 numbered 13 men, including Kennedy. There was Ensign Leonard Tom, the executive officer, a former college football star and Kennedy's right hand. Machinist's mate Patrick McMahon, the oldest aboard at 37, an experienced engine man. Andrew Jackson Kirksey and Harold Marney, motor machinists' mates who kept the 3 12-cylinder Packard engines running. Edmund Drewich, George Ross, Charles Harris, Raymond Albert, John Maguire, Edgar Maurer, Leon Drawdy, and William Johnston rounded out the crew. They came from Ohio and California, from small farms and big cities, from families that had nothing and families that had enough. The only thing they shared was youth and the willingness to climb into a plywood boat and hunt steel warships in the dark. Kennedy earned his crew's respect not through his connections or education, but by treating them as equals and sharing their discomfort without complaint. He never asked them to do anything he would not do himself. When the boat needed work, he worked beside them. When the mission was dangerous, he led from the front. They called him Skipper and followed his orders not because regulations required it, but because they trusted him to make decisions that gave them the best chance of coming home alive. In return, Kennedy learned to trust them with his life, which, in combat, was the only currency that mattered. The night of August 1, 1943, began like so many others in the Solomon Islands campaign. 15 PT boats received orders to patrol Blackett Strait, south of Kolombangara Island, to intercept a Japanese convoy reported to be running supplies south. It was a routine mission, the kind the crews had executed dozens of times before, dangerous but familiar. What made this night different was conditions that reduced routine danger to existential threat. There was no moon, no stars, only blackness so complete that sailors could not see their own hands in front of their faces. The darkness was physical, oppressive, disorienting. Navigation became guesswork, and collision a constant possibility. PT-109 took its position in the patrol line along with the other boats. Only one vessel in the four-boat section had radar, and it departed to chase a target, leaving Kennedy and two other boats blind in the night. They moved slowly through the strait, engines muffled to avoid detection, straining eyes and ears for any sign of the enemy. The water was calm, almost glassy, and the silence was broken only by the soft burble of idling engines and the occasional whispered radio communication. At approximately 2:30 in the morning of August 2, the impossible happened. Out of the absolute darkness, without warning, a shape materialized off PT-109's starboard bow. It was the Japanese destroyer Amagiri, cutting through the water at 40 knots, a 1,000-ton steel warship bearing down on the small wooden boat like a freight train. Kennedy ordered emergency evasive maneuvers, spinning the wheel hard, but there was no time and no room to escape. The destroyer struck PT-109 amidships, slicing through the boat like an axe through kindling, the impact so violent that men were thrown into the air like rag dolls. The collision killed machinist's mate Harold Marney and Andrew Kirksey instantly, their bodies disappearing into the black water. The bow section of PT-109, with Kennedy and 4 other men aboard, remained afloat, but the stern section, with its engines and fuel tanks, sank immediately. The surviving crew found themselves scattered in the dark ocean, clinging to debris, calling out for each other, not knowing if the Japanese destroyer would circle back to finish them off, or if rescue was even possible. They had no idea where they were except somewhere in enemy-controlled waters, miles from friendly territory, with dawn approaching and Japanese aircraft that would strafe anything American they found in daylight. Kennedy gathered his men, taking roll call in the darkness, accounting for survivors. 11 men had lived through the collision, but several were injured. Patrick McMahon, the engine man, had been trapped in the engine room when the collision occurred and had suffered severe burns on his face, arms and hands when flaming gasoline washed over him. He could barely swim, could not see properly, and was in terrible pain. George Ross and Raymond Albert had sustained minor injuries. The rest were battered and bruised, but physically intact, though the psychological shock of having their boat destroyed beneath them left everyone shaken. The bow section of PT-109 remained afloat, barely, and the crew clung to it through the rest of the night, hoping for rescue that did not come. When dawn broke, revealing their vulnerable position, Kennedy made the decision that would define everything that followed. They could not stay where they were, exposed to Japanese aircraft and enemy patrol boats. He could see a small island about 3 miles to the southeast, barely visible on the horizon. They would swim for it, and they would swim together. What followed was an ordeal that tested every man beyond anything they had experienced or imagined. Kennedy took the strap of McMahon's life jacket in his teeth and began towing the badly burned man toward the island. 3 miles through open ocean, swimming for his life, while towing a man who outweighed him, Kennedy made that swim, with his chronically bad back screaming in protest, with exhaustion that threatened to drag him under, with the constant fear that sharks or Japanese patrols would find them before they reached safety. The other men swam alongside, supporting each other, clinging to pieces of timber, pulling themselves forward stroke by painful stroke. The swim took 5 hours. When they finally dragged themselves onto the beach of what they would later learn was called Plum Pudding Island, a tiny piece of coral and sand barely 100 yards across, they were beyond exhaustion. But they were alive, and they were together, and that meant there was still hope. Kennedy had led them to safety, had literally pulled McMahon through the water for 3 miles without stopping, had gotten all 11 survivors to land when the easier choice would have been to save himself and leave the injured behind. Plum Pudding Island offered nothing but coconuts and coral. No fresh water, no food beyond green coconuts that made them sick, no shelter from the brutal tropical sun. The men scraped coral to make a crude shelter, treated McMahon's burns as best they could with seawater, and tried to comprehend what had happened to them. They were officially missing in action, and back at the American PT base on Rendova, their names had already been added to the casualty lists. No one knew they had survived. No one was coming to rescue them. Kennedy refused to accept that outcome. On the first night on Plum Pudding, he made the decision to swim out to Ferguson Passage, a channel where American PT boats might patrol. He took a pistol, a lantern, and his determination, and swam out into the darkness, hoping to intercept friendly boats and signal for rescue. He spent hours in the water, swimming back and forth across the channel, but no boats appeared. The current caught him, pulled him far off course, and he barely managed to swim back to the island by dawn, exhausted and defeated, but still alive. The next day, Kennedy and Ensign Ross decided to swim to a larger nearby island called Nauru, hoping to find food, water, or perhaps a way to signal for help. They found a small canoe hidden in the brush, packages of crackers and candy left by Japanese forces, and crucially, a 50-gallon drum of drinkable water. Kennedy filled the canoe and brought it back to Plum Pudding, giving his crew their first fresh water in days. But they were still stranded, still alone, still with no clear path to rescue. It was on Nauru Island that salvation finally appeared, though not in any form Kennedy could have anticipated. Two Solomon Islanders, Byuku Gasa and Eroni Kumana, paddled up to the island in their dugout canoe. They were coast watchers, locals who worked with Allied intelligence to monitor Japanese movements and rescue downed pilots and shipwrecked sailors. Kennedy had learned some pidgin English from interacting with natives earlier in his deployment, and he was able to communicate with Gasa and Kumana, convincing them that he and his crew were Americans in need of rescue. But how to send a message? They had no radio, no way to signal the distant American base. Gasa showed Kennedy how to carve words into the husk of a green coconut. Using his knife, Kennedy scratched out a message in crude letters. Nauru ISL Commander. Native knows posit. He can pilot. 11 alive. Needs small boat. Kennedy. Gasa and Kumana took the coconut and paddled away into the distance, promising to deliver it to the Allied coast watcher, Australian Lieutenant Reg Evans, who had a radio and could coordinate rescue. For 2 more agonizing days, Kennedy and his crew waited, not knowing if the message had gotten through, if help was coming, if they would be found before Japanese patrols discovered them. They moved to nearby Olasana Island, which had more coconuts and better cover. McMahon's burns were infected and getting worse. All of them were weakened by hunger, dehydration, and exhaustion. But Kennedy refused to give up hope, refused to let his men surrender to despair. He had gotten them this far, and he would get them home, or die trying. On the evening of August 7th, 8 islanders appeared with supplies and a message. Lieutenant Evans had received the coconut message and was coordinating rescue. Kennedy was taken by canoe to Gomu Island, where he met Evans face-to-face and planned the rescue operation. That night, 2 PT boats, guided by Kennedy's knowledge of the reefs and shallows, made their way to Olasana Island. At 11:30 p.m. on August 8, 6 days after PT-109 had been sunk, Kennedy and his crew were finally rescued. When the rescuers called out to wake the sleeping men, Kennedy, exhausted and spent but still possessed of his sardonic humor, called back, "Where the hell have you been?" The rescue officer replied, "We got some food for you." Kennedy answered, "No thanks, I just had a coconut." For his courage and leadership during the PT-109 incident, Kennedy was awarded the Navy and Marine Corps Medal, the Navy's highest honor for heroism not involving combat with an enemy. But the true significance of those 6 days went far beyond any medal. Kennedy had proven to himself and to his crew that he was not merely a privileged son with good connections, but a leader who would sacrifice everything to bring his men home. He had taken the measure of himself under conditions where comfort and privilege meant nothing, where survival required the kind of raw courage and endurance that cannot be faked or purchased. The sickly second son had led men through an ordeal that would have broken stronger, healthier men. The intellectual who wrote books about why England slept had shown that he would not sleep when his men needed him. The young officer who had pulled strings to get into combat had discovered that leadership is earned through action, not inherited through birth. The boy who had lived in his brother's shadow had cast his own light in the darkest of nights, becoming in the process the kind of man who could lead a nation when his time came. When John Kennedy finally returned to the United States months later, after further Pacific service that aggravated all his health problems and left him dependent on crutches due to his worsening back, he carried with him something more valuable than medals or commendations. He carried the knowledge that he had been tested by fire and had not been found wanting. He carried the memory of 11 men who had trusted him with their lives and whom he had brought home alive. He carried a story that writer John Hersey would later tell in The New Yorker, a story that would help launch a political career built on more than family connections and money. But most importantly, he carried the understanding that heroism is not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. That leadership is not about commanding, but about serving. That courage is measured not in moments of triumph, but in hours of endurance when hope seems lost, but you refuse to surrender. The baptism by fire had transformed John Kennedy in ways that no amount of privilege or education ever could. The boy had become a man. The man had become a leader. And the leader would one day become the president who stood firm when the world teetered on the edge of nuclear holocaust. But first, he had to swim 3 miles through dark water, towing an injured sailor, proving to himself that he was capable of the kind of sacrifice that greatness demands. The struggle, from war hero to politician, makes men and unmakes them in equal measure. For some, it is the peak of their lives, the time when they are most alive and most themselves, and everything that follows is epilogue. For others, war is a crucible that burns away impurities and leaves behind something harder and more refined, transforming them into versions of themselves they never knew existed. John Kennedy belonged to the second category. The war had tested him and found him capable, but it was what came after the war that would reveal whether that capability could be translated into something larger than personal survival. The war ended for Kennedy in December 1943, when his persistent back problems and recurrent malaria finally forced the Navy to send him home. He spent weeks in a naval hospital in Rhode Island, undergoing treatment that provided temporary relief but no permanent cure. His spine had been damaged by the football injury at Harvard, worsened by the impact of the PT-109 collision, and aggravated by months of physical stress in the Pacific. Doctors told him he would deal with pain for the rest of his life. The tropical diseases he had contracted would flare up periodically, causing fevers and weakness at unpredictable times. The body that had rebelled against him since childhood now carried new wounds to add to its catalogue of afflictions. But the war was not over for the Kennedy family. Joe Jr., the golden son destined for greatness, remained in Europe flying bomber missions. He volunteered for a particularly dangerous experimental mission in August 1944, piloting a plane loaded with explosives that would be guided by remote control to its target. The plane exploded prematurely over the English Channel, killing Joe and his co-pilot instantly. The brother who was supposed to be president, the firstborn who would fulfill their father's political ambitions, was gone in a flash of fire and pressure, leaving behind a father's shattered dreams and a family's devastating grief. Disregos Kennedy's presidential ambitions did not die with his oldest son, but merely transferred to his second. Jack had never wanted a political career, had seen himself perhaps as a teacher or journalist, someone who observed and analyzed rather than participated in the often sordid business of campaigns and compromises. But his father's will was implacable. his expectations non-negotiable. Joe Jr. had been groomed to be president. Now Jack would fulfill that destiny instead. The second son's reprieve was over. The shadow he had lived in his entire life had lifted, but only because his brother lay dead in the English Channel, and that freedom came with obligations Jack could not refuse. After brief work as a journalist, covering the United Nations Conference and British elections in 1945, Kennedy entered politics in 1946 at age 29. He ran for the House of Representatives in Massachusetts's 11th Congressional District, working-class area of Boston. The entire Kennedy family mobilized for the campaign. His sisters and mother hosted tea parties to meet voters. His brother Robert, still in his early 20s, worked as campaign manager. His father's money funded a sophisticated operation that overwhelmed the opposition. Jack himself campaigned with a ferocity that surprised observers who knew him as the charming but somewhat aimless young man from before the war. The campaign revealed skills that Kennedy had not fully realized he possessed. He was a natural on the stump, able to connect with ordinary voters despite his privileged background. His war record played well with veterans and their families, the story of PT 109 becoming a centerpiece of his political identity. He spoke in a casual, direct style that contrasted with the bombastic oratory common among politicians of the era. People felt like he was talking to them rather than at them. He won the primary easily and the general election in a landslide. And in January 1947, John Kennedy took his seat in the House of Representatives. His congressional career was competent but not distinguished. He served on the Education and Labor Committee and the Veterans Affairs Committee, focused on issues relevant to his district, supported the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan as bulwarks against Soviet expansion. But Kennedy chafed at the limitations of being one of 435 representatives, frustrated by the slow pace of the legislative process and the reality that junior congressmen had little real power to shape policy. He was re-elected easily in 1948 and 1950, but his ambitions had outgrown the House. In 1952, he decided to run for the Senate against the incumbent Henry Cabot Lodge, Jr., a member of one of Massachusetts's most prominent political families. This was the campaign that would truly test Kennedy's political skills. Lodge was experienced, well-funded, and popular. The Republican tide that year brought Dwight Eisenhower to the presidency and threatened to sweep Democrats out of office across the nation. Kennedy faced long odds and the prejudices that still existed against Irish Catholic politicians in a state where those prejudices ran deep despite the large Irish Catholic population. But the Kennedy operation, refined and expanded from the House races, proved unstoppable. Jack campaigned everywhere, shaking hands until his own hands bled, appearing at factory gates and union halls and suburban living rooms, using his family's resources and his own growing political talents to overwhelm Lodge's traditional advantages. One crucial development during the Senate campaign was Kennedy's deepening relationship with Theodore Sorensen, a young legislative aide who would become his most important speechwriter and advisor. Sorensen understood Kennedy's mind, could translate his thoughts into prose that sang, and provided the intellectual firepower to match Kennedy's political instincts. Together, they formed a partnership that would last through Kennedy's presidency, with Sorensen crafting many of the most memorable speeches in American political history. The Kennedy-Sorensen collaboration was like Lennon-McCartney for politics, each making the other better, their combined output greater than the sum of individual contributions. Kennedy defeated Lodge in 1952, even as Eisenhower carried Massachusetts in the presidential race. It was a remarkable political achievement, separating himself from the national Democratic ticket and building a personal coalition that crossed traditional party lines. The victory made Kennedy a rising star in Democratic politics, but it also revealed the limits of his appeal. He had won by being all things to all people, taking moderate positions on most issues, avoiding controversial stands that might alienate potential supporters. This was smart politics, but uncertain leadership, leaving observers unsure what Kennedy truly believed beyond his own advancement. 1953 brought a different kind of test when Kennedy married Jacqueline Lee Bouvier in Newport, Rhode Island. Jackie was beautiful, sophisticated, cultured, educated at Vassar and the Sorbonne, fluent in French and Spanish, the daughter of a wealthy New York socialite family. She was also intensely private, uncomfortable with the public nature of political life, more interested in art and literature than campaign rallies and rubber chicken dinners. The marriage brought together two people who seemed almost perfectly matched on the surface, but whose priorities and temperaments were quite different. She wanted a private life with her husband. He lived entirely in the public eye. She valued cultural refinement. He valued political victory. They would have to navigate these tensions throughout their marriage, finding ways to complement each other while maintaining their separate identities. Kangi Kennedy's Senate career was interrupted in 1954 by back surgery that nearly killed him. The operation was supposed to reduce his chronic pain, but post-surgical infections brought him to death's door. He received last rites, and doctors told his family to prepare for the worst. But Kennedy survived, as he had survived so many other medical crises, though the recovery was long and agonizing. During months of convalescence, he worked with Sorensen on a book about senators who had taken courageous stands on principle, even when those stands threatened their political careers. Profiles in Courage was published in 1956 and won the Pulitzer Prize for biography in 1957, though questions about how much Sorensen had contributed to the writing would dog Kennedy later. Defensive Kennedy's reputation as a serious intellectual, someone who thought deeply about political courage and moral leadership. But it also raised uncomfortable questions about Kennedy's own courage on controversial issues. The most glaring example was his failure to take a clear stand against Senator Joseph McCarthy's anti-communist witch hunts. Kennedy missed the Senate vote, censuring McCarthy in 1954 due to his back surgery, a convenient excuse that allowed him to avoid alienating either McCarthy's supporters or his critics. Friends of civil liberties noted that Kennedy could have paired his vote or issued a statement, but he chose silence. It was politically expedient but morally ambiguous, suggesting that Kennedy's understanding of courage was more theoretical than practical. In 1956, Kennedy made a bid for the vice presidential nomination at the Democratic National Convention, delivering a speech that electrified delegates but losing the nomination to Estes Kefauver. The defeat was fortunate. The Eisenhower-Nixon ticket demolished Adlai Stevenson and Kefauver that November, and being associated with that loss would have damaged Kennedy's future prospects. Instead, he emerged from the convention as a national figure, young and articulate and telegenic, untainted by Stevenson's defeat, and positioned perfectly for a presidential run in 1960. But first came the civil rights question that Kennedy had so carefully avoided. Throughout the 1950s, the civil rights movement gained momentum, challenging the Jim Crow segregation that oppressed Black Americans across the South. Kennedy's record on civil rights was cautious at best. He supported some civil rights legislation, but opposed key provisions that would have given the federal government stronger enforcement powers. He calculated that taking strong stands on civil rights would cost him Southern support, essential for winning the presidential nomination and election. It was pragmatic politics that revealed how Kennedy prioritized winning power over using power for moral purposes, at least early in his career. By 1959, Kennedy had decided to run for president in 1960. He was 42 years old, young by presidential standards, Catholic in a nation that had never elected a Catholic president, experienced but not deeply so, charismatic but somewhat shallow in his policy convictions. He had wealth, connections, a compelling personal story, and political instincts honed through multiple campaigns. What he lacked was clarity about what he would do with presidential power beyond obtaining it. The war hero had become a politician. The politician had become a senator, and now the senator was reaching for the highest office. But the crucial question remained unanswered. What did John Kennedy believe deeply enough to fight for, even at the cost of political advantage? That answer would only come later, when events forced him to choose between political expediency and moral leadership. When being president required more than winning elections. The Impossible Dream, 1960. The presidential campaign of 1960 represented a watershed moment in American political history, the point where the old ways of choosing presidents gave way to something new and modern and unpredictable. John Kennedy understood this transformation better than most of his opponents, recognized that television and image and youth would matter more in 1960 than they had in any previous election. He was made for this moment, built for a campaign that would reward style as much as substance, appearance as much as achievement. But getting to that moment required navigating a democratic primary process designed to stop insurgent candidates like him, then defeating in the general election the sitting vice president of a popular administration. The impossible dream required making the impossible seem inevitable. The obstacles facing Kennedy were formidable and obvious. He was Catholic, and the only Catholic who had run for president, Al Smith in 1928, had been crushed in a landslide that demonstrated America's anti-Catholic prejudice. He was young, looking even younger than his 42 years, raising questions about whether he had sufficient experience and maturity for the presidency. He was wealthy, which insulated him from normal political pressures, but also made him seem out of touch with ordinary Americans struggling through recessions and uncertainty. And his record was thin: 6 years in the House and 8 in the Senate, without any signature legislative achievements to point to as evidence of leadership. Disregard advantages that his opponents lacked. His father's fortune meant he could campaign without worrying about fundraising, could hire the best staff, could run advertisements, and organize in ways that poorer candidates could not match. His war record gave him credibility on military and foreign policy issues that desk-bound politicians lacked. His family mobilized as a political force, with Bobby serving as campaign manager and bringing ruthless efficiency to operations, while sisters and mother continued their outreach to voters. Most importantly, Kennedy recognized that television was transforming politics from an auditory experience to a visual one, and he looked better on television than any other candidate in either party. The primary campaign began with Kennedy needing to prove he could win, that being Catholic and young were not disqualifying factors. He entered and won the New Hampshire primary, then moved to Wisconsin, where he faced Minnesota Senator Hubert Humphrey, a liberal hero beloved by labor unions and progressives. Kennedy's victory in Wisconsin demonstrated organizational strength, but raised questions because he won primarily in Catholic districts. The crucial test came in West Virginia, a heavily Protestant state where conventional wisdom said no Catholic could win. Kennedy campaigned there with intensity and sophistication, addressing the religion issue head-on rather than trying to avoid it. In a televised address to Protestant ministers in Houston, Kennedy confronted religious prejudice directly and firmly. He declared his absolute belief in the separation of church and state, insisted that he would not take orders from the Vatican, and turned the question around by asking whether 1/4 of Americans should be excluded from the presidency because of their faith. The speech was masterful, transforming a potential liability into evidence of courage and principle. When Kennedy won West Virginia decisively, defeating Humphrey and knocking him out of the race, the path to the nomination opened. The primary victories demonstrated that a Catholic could win Protestant voters, that youth could be an asset rather than a liability, that Kennedy was a serious candidate rather than just a wealthy senator with presidential ambitions. The Democratic National Convention in Los Angeles that July was never really in doubt. Kennedy arrived with more than enough delegates to win on the first ballot, his primary victories having convinced party leaders that he was the strongest candidate. But he made a crucial decision in choosing his running mate, selecting Lyndon Johnson, despite the personal animosity between them and the objections of Kennedy's liberal supporters. Johnson was Senate Majority Leader, a master of congressional politics, and, most importantly, a Texan who could help Kennedy win southern states that would be lost without him. It was a cold political calculation that put winning ahead of personal preference, exactly the kind of pragmatic decision that would characterize Kennedy's approach to politics throughout his career. The general election pitted Kennedy against Richard Nixon, Eisenhower's vice president for 8 years and one of the most experienced politicians in America. Nixon had the advantages of being associated with a popular administration, having served at the highest levels of government and being Protestant in a nation where that still mattered to many voters. But he also carried the burden of 8 years in the vice presidency, which had left him with little independent identity and tied him to Eisenhower's policies even when those policies were unpopular. Nixon was also, crucially, uncomfortable on television, and in 1960 that discomfort would prove fatal to his chances. The 4 presidential debates between Kennedy and Nixon marked the true arrival of television as the dominant force in American politics. More than 70 million Americans watched the first debate on September 26, 1960, and what they saw transformed the race. Kennedy appeared confident, relaxed, and vigorous, speaking directly to the camera and to the American people. Nixon appeared uncomfortable and tired, his 5 o'clock shadow making him look sinister rather than experienced, his nervousness visible in the way he shifted and perspired. People who listened to the debate on radio thought Nixon had won. People who watched it on television thought Kennedy had won decisively. The difference between those two perceptions revealed everything about how politics had changed. The debates allowed Kennedy to demonstrate that he was Nixon's equal in knowledge and understanding of issues, that youth did not mean inexperience or inability to handle presidential responsibilities. He held his own on foreign policy, matched Nixon point for point on domestic issues, and most importantly, looked like a president while doing it. The debates did not win Kennedy the election by themselves, but they made victory possible by eliminating doubts about whether he was ready for the presidency. After the debates, the race became about the future versus the past, youth versus age, change versus continuity, and Kennedy was positioned perfectly to be the candidate of change. The religious question haunted the campaign, despite Kennedy's West Virginia victory and Houston speech. Anti-Catholic literature circulated widely in Protestant communities, warning that electing Kennedy would mean the Pope would control American policy. Southern Baptist ministers preached against Kennedy from their pulpits. Protestant voters, who might otherwise have supported Kennedy because of his positions on issues, found themselves torn between policy preferences and religious identity. Nixon officially stayed above the religious controversy, but his campaign did little to discourage the anti-Catholic sentiment that worked in his favor. Kennedy campaigned relentlessly through the fall, appearing in multiple states each day, shaking countless hands, speaking to crowds large and small, using his youth and energy to project vitality while suggesting that Nixon represented tired old thinking. He promised to "get America moving again," a slogan that resonated with voters frustrated by economic stagnation and concerned about Soviet advances in the space race and nuclear weapons development. He spoke of a new frontier that would challenge Americans to accomplish great things, to explore space and defeat poverty and spread freedom around the world. The rhetoric was stirring, even if the policy details were vague, selling hope and possibility rather than specific programs. Election night 1960 stretched long into the morning of November 9th as returns trickled in from across the nation. The race was extraordinarily close, one of the closest in American history. Kennedy won the Electoral College 303 to 219, but the popular vote was nearly tied. Out of almost 69 million votes cast, Kennedy won by only 827 votes, a margin of barely 1/10%. He lost Protestant voters decisively, but won Catholic voters overwhelmingly. He lost southern states, but held on to enough of them, thanks to Johnson, to build an electoral college victory. He lost older voters, but won younger ones. The coalition was fragile and narrow, but it was enough. Position were immediate allegations of vote fraud, particularly in Illinois and Texas, where suspicious patterns in vote counting in Democratic-controlled counties raised questions about whether Kennedy had really won those states. Nixon considered challenging the results, but ultimately decided against it, judging that a prolonged election dispute would be too damaging to the country. Whether Kennedy really won or whether the election was stolen remains debated by historians, but what matters for the historical record is that he took office as the legitimate president, having won enough states to claim electoral victory, even if questions lingered about the margins in particular places. On January 20th, 1961, John Fitzgerald Kennedy stood on the Capitol steps in Washington to take the oath of office as the 35th President of the United States. Snow had fallen the night before, and the morning was bitterly cold, but the day was bright and clear. At 43 years old, Kennedy was the youngest person ever elected president, succeeding at 70, the oldest president ever to serve. The contrast was deliberate and symbolic, the passing of the torch from one generation to another, from the men who had led America through World War II to the men who had fought in that war and would now lead America through whatever challenges lay ahead. Kennedy's inaugural address, crafted primarily by Theodore Sorensen, but bearing Kennedy's rhetorical fingerprints throughout, struck notes of idealism and challenge that resonated far beyond America's borders. He spoke of defending freedom in its hour of maximum danger, of bearing any burden and paying any price to ensure the survival and success of liberty. He challenged Americans to ask not what their country could do for them, but what they could do for their country. He spoke to the world, offering partnership to allies, negotiation to adversaries, help to the developing world, and a commitment to human rights that transcended national boundaries. The speech was masterful theater, quotable and memorable, establishing Kennedy as an eloquent voice for American idealism. But rhetoric is not policy, and inspiring words do not solve difficult problems. Kennedy had won the presidency by the narrowest of margins, with no mandate for bold action and no clear sense of what he wanted to accomplish beyond winning itself. The impossible dream had been achieved, but now came the hard part, figuring out what to do with the power he had fought so hard to obtain. The young president stood at the threshold of leadership, having proven he could win elections, but not yet having demonstrated he could lead a nation through crisis and toward greatness. That test would come soon enough, and it would reveal whether John Kennedy was truly the man his rhetoric suggested, or merely another politician who looked good on television. Trial by fire, early presidency. Undergoing. The Oval Office is a room that transforms men, revealing character under pressures that no amount of preparation can fully anticipate. John Kennedy entered that office on January 20th, 1961, with intelligence, charm, political skill, and soaring rhetoric, but without the experience of leadership in genuine crisis, without having made decisions where lives hung in the balance and nations' fates turned on judgment calls. The early months of his presidency would provide that experience in the hardest way possible, through failures and near disasters that tested his inexperience and revealed both his weaknesses and his capacity to learn from mistakes that might have destroyed lesser men. Ignoring Kennedy inherited from Eisenhower a plan to overthrow Fidel Castro's communist government in Cuba using a force of CIA-trained Cuban exiles. The plan was deeply flawed from the start, based on optimistic assumptions about popular uprisings that had no basis in reality, planned by intelligence officials who had convinced themselves that anything was possible if you just had enough confidence and deniability. But Kennedy was new to office, uncertain of his own judgment against the supposed expertise of intelligence professionals and military leaders, and he approved the operation with modifications designed to maintain the fiction of American non-involvement. Clang of Pigs invasion in April 1961 was a catastrophe from the moment the first exile brigade hit the beach. There was no popular uprising. Castro's forces were ready and waiting. The promised air support never materialized because Kennedy, trying to maintain deniability, had cancelled the airstrikes at the last minute. The exile force was overwhelmed, with some killed and more than 1,000 captured. The whole world knew that America was behind the invasion, despite attempts to hide involvement. Castro's government was strengthened rather than weakened. Soviet influence in Cuba was enhanced rather than diminished, and Kennedy's administration was humiliated before it had even completed its first 100 days. Crimson, to his credit, Kennedy immediately took full public responsibility for the disaster. He did not blame the CIA or the military planners or the previous administration, though all bore responsibility. He stood before the American people and acknowledged that the failure was his, that he had approved the operation and therefore owned its consequences. The public appreciated his honesty, and his approval ratings actually increased after the Bay of Pigs. But Kennedy himself was deeply shaken. He had learned that intelligence agencies and military leaders could be wrong, that their confidence did not equal competence, that he could not simply defer to supposed experts, but had to trust his own judgment, even when that judgment conflicted with consensus. The failure in Cuba emboldened Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, who concluded that Kennedy was weak and inexperienced, that the young president could be pushed around and intimidated. When Kennedy met Khrushchev for a summit in Vienna in June 1961, the Soviet leader was aggressive and confrontational, bullying Kennedy on every issue from Berlin to nuclear testing to the developing world. Khrushchev saw Kennedy as too young intellectual, not prepared well for decision-making in crisis situations, according to Soviet officials. Kennedy emerged from the Vienna meeting shaken, recognizing that Khrushchev had taken his measure and found him wanting. The Berlin crisis that summer tested Kennedy's resolve. Khrushchev demanded that Western powers leave West Berlin, the democratic outpost deep inside communist East Germany that symbolized freedom behind the Iron Curtain. Kennedy refused, sending additional troops to Berlin and making clear that America would defend the city's freedom even at the risk of war. When the East Germans, with Soviet approval, built the Berlin Wall in August 1961 to stop the flood of refugees escaping to the West, Kennedy denounced the wall as a monument to the failure of communism, but did not attempt to tear it down by force. It was a careful balance, standing firm on principle while avoiding actions that might trigger World War III. Against this backdrop of foreign policy challenges, Kennedy launched initiatives that showed his idealistic vision for America's role in the world. In March 1961, he established the Peace Corps, sending young Americans abroad as volunteers to help developing nations with education, agriculture, healthcare, and construction. The Peace Corps embodied Kennedy's call to service, his belief that Americans should help others not for strategic advantage, but because it was the right thing to do. Within 2 years, more than 7,000 volunteers had joined, and the program became one of the most successful and enduring legacies of Kennedy's presidency. The space program represented another arena where Kennedy could define American ambition. The Soviet Union had launched Sputnik in 1957 and put Yuri Gagarin into orbit in April 1961, demonstrating technological superiority that embarrassed and frightened Americans. Kennedy consulted with NASA and military leaders, asking what goal America could achieve before the Soviets, where American advantages in resources and organization could overcome Soviet head starts. The answer was the moon. Sending a human to the moon and returning them safely to Earth would require technological capabilities that the Soviets did not yet possess and would take years to develop, time during which American economic strength could be brought to bear. On May 25, 1961, Kennedy stood before Congress and committed America to landing a man on the moon before the decade ended. It was an audacious goal, perhaps insane, considering that America had only just put Alan Shepard into space for a 15-minute suborbital flight. The cost would be enormous, perhaps $20 billion or more. Challenges were immense, requiring the development of rockets, spacecraft, computers, and techniques that did not yet exist. But Kennedy understood that the goal was worth pursuing not because it was easy, but because it was hard. Because accomplishing the impossible would unite the nation and demonstrate that democracy could achieve what communism could not. Domestically, Kennedy's early presidency struggled to find its footing. He had promised action on civil rights during the campaign, but moved cautiously once in office, worried about alienating Southern Democrats, whose support he needed for other legislation. He appointed unprecedented numbers of African Americans to government positions and strengthened the Civil Rights Commission, but he avoided pushing for major civil rights legislation. When Freedom Riders challenged segregation in interstate transportation in 1961, enduring brutal beatings from white mobs in Alabama, Kennedy's administration sent federal marshals to protect them, but urged them to stop their protests, rather than defending their right to challenge unjust laws. This caution on civil rights reflected Kennedy's overall approach to domestic policy in his first 2 years. Propose moderate measures, avoid confrontations with Congress, build support gradually, rather than demanding immediate action. He proposed federal aid to education, health insurance for the elderly, economic development assistance for distressed regions, and increases in the minimum wage. Some of these proposals passed in modified form, others stalled in Congress. But none represented the kind of bold leadership that Kennedy's rhetoric had promised. He was governing as a cautious pragmatist, while speaking as an idealistic visionary, and the gap between words and actions was becoming increasingly apparent. The economy provided both challenges and opportunities. Kennedy inherited a recession and sluggish growth, with unemployment rates above 6% and concerns about America falling behind the Soviet Union in economic dynamism. His advisors, led by Walter Heller, chairman of the Council of Economic Advisers, advocated for Keynesian-style tax cuts to stimulate growth. Kennedy was initially skeptical, concerned about budget deficits, but gradually came to embrace the idea that strategic deficit spending during weak economic times could produce higher growth that would eventually generate more tax revenue. It was economic sophistication that challenged conventional wisdom about balanced budgets, and it would bear fruit later in his presidency. By the summer of 1962, Kennedy's presidency was in trouble. The Bay of Pigs failure still lingered in memory. The Vienna summit had exposed his inexperience. The Berlin crisis was unresolved. Civil rights activists were frustrated by his caution. Economic growth remained sluggish. Congressional relations were difficult, with Southern Democrats blocking much of his domestic agenda and Republicans united in opposition. Kennedy's approval ratings had declined from their post-inaugural heights, and political analysts questioned whether he would be a one-term president, whether this young man with so much promise had the capability to lead effectively. What Kennedy needed was a crisis that would test him completely, that would require every lesson learned from his failures, that would demand the kind of leadership that could not be faked or performed, but had to be real and earned. He needed a moment where his judgment would determine whether humanity survived or perished, where the wrong decision meant nuclear war, and the right decision meant navigating through impossibility to safety. That crisis was coming, hidden in reconnaissance photographs and intelligence reports, growing closer with every day that Soviet ships steamed toward Cuba, carrying cargo that would bring the world to the edge of destruction. The trial by fire of the early presidency was about to give way to something far more intense, a test that would define Kennedy's legacy and determine whether he was truly capable of the greatness his rhetoric promised. 13 days. The brink of annihilation. October 14th, 1962, dawned clear over Cuba. Perfect weather for reconnaissance. A U-2 spy plane, piloted by Major Richard Heiser, flew high above the island, its cameras clicking at regular intervals, capturing images of the Cuban landscape from 70,000 feet. When photo interpreters at the National Photographic Interpretation Center examined the developed film the next morning, they saw something that made the blood drain from their faces. In western Cuba, near San Cristobal, construction activity that could mean only one thing: medium-range ballistic missile sites. Soviet nuclear missiles, capable of striking American cities with virtually no warning, were being installed 90 miles from Florida. The photographs reached President Kennedy on the morning of October 16th. For several minutes, he studied them in silence, understanding immediately the magnitude of what he was seeing. Soviet Premier Khrushchev had lied to him, had promised that Soviet weapons shipments to Cuba were defensive only, had looked Kennedy in the eye and denied any intention of placing offensive nuclear weapons in the Western Hemisphere. Now the lie was exposed in black and white photographs that showed launch pads, missile transporters, and support equipment for nuclear weapons that could kill tens of millions of Americans within minutes of being launched. Kennedy's first decision shaped everything that followed. He chose not to announce the discovery immediately, not to react publicly or militarily before carefully considering options and consequences. Instead, he convened a secret group of his most trusted advisors, which became known as the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, or ExComm. For 6 days, this group met in secret while Kennedy maintained his public schedule, appearing at campaign events and official functions as if nothing unusual was happening, buying time to formulate a response that might prevent nuclear war rather than trigger it. The ExComm meetings revealed the full range of American response options, from doing nothing to full-scale invasion of Cuba. The Joint Chiefs of Staff pushed hard for immediate military action, arguing for airstrikes to destroy the missile sites, followed by invasion to overthrow Castro's government. General Curtis LeMay, the Air Force chief, was particularly aggressive, telling Kennedy that anything short of military action would be seen as weakness and appeasement. But Kennedy had learned from the Bay of Pigs not to simply accept military advice without questioning it. He asked hard questions. Could airstrikes guarantee destruction of all missiles? What if some missiles survived and were launched in retaliation? What would the Soviets do if America invaded Cuba? Would they seize West Berlin in response, forcing America to either start World War III or back down in humiliation? Secretary Brothers, including Defense's Brother Robert, the Attorney General, argued for a naval blockade that would prevent additional weapons from reaching Cuba while leaving diplomatic room for the Soviets to back down. A blockade was technically an act of war, but it was less provocative than airstrikes or invasion, and it gave Khrushchev options beyond either surrender or nuclear war. Kennedy gradually came to favor this approach, recognizing that the goal was not to humiliate the Soviet Union, but to get the missiles out of Cuba without starting a war that could kill hundreds of millions of people. On Monday evening, October 22nd, Kennedy addressed the nation on television. More than 100 million Americans watched as their young president, speaking in measured tones that conveyed both determination and caution, revealed the presence of Soviet missiles in Cuba and announced his response. America would establish a naval quarantine around Cuba, preventing the delivery of additional offensive weapons. American forces would inspect all ships approaching Cuba, turning back any carrying weapons. The United States would regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union, requiring full retaliatory response. Kennedy demanded that the Soviet Union dismantle and remove all offensive weapons from Cuba, and he made clear that America would not back down from this position. Of speech was a masterpiece, a clear line, while leaving diplomatic room for resolution. But it also raised the stakes to the absolute maximum. making nuclear confrontation a real possibility for the first time in the Cold War. As Kennedy concluded his address and the television cameras switched off, the world held its breath, waiting to see how Khrushchev would respond, whether the Soviet leader would retreat or escalate, whether humanity would step back from the abyss or plunge into it. The next 6 days were among the most dangerous in human history. Soviet ships continued steaming toward Cuba, their cargo unknown, their intentions unclear. American warships took up positions along the quarantine line, ordered to intercept and board any vessel attempting to reach Cuba. American strategic forces went to DEFCON 2, one step below actual war, the highest alert level ever reached. B-52 bombers, armed with nuclear weapons, flew continuous patrols, ready to strike Soviet targets within minutes of receiving orders. Polaris missile submarines took up positions in the ocean, their nuclear missiles targeted on Soviet cities. Soviet strategic forces adopted similar postures, creating a situation where a misunderstanding or accident could trigger a chain reaction leading to global nuclear war. On Wednesday, October 24th, the first test of the quarantine came as Soviet ships approached the interdiction line. Dean Rusk, the Secretary of State, famously remarked, "We're eyeball to eyeball," as American destroyers moved to intercept. Then, at the last moment, the Soviet ships stopped in the water and turned back. Khrushchev had blinked first, choosing not to force a direct confrontation at sea. But the missiles already in Cuba remained, and Soviet technicians continued working feverishly to make them operational. American intelligence estimated that some missiles might be ready to launch within days. The crisis intensified on Friday, October 26th, when Kennedy received 2 letters from Khrushchev that seemed to contradict each other. The first, long and emotional, suggested that the Soviets would remove the missiles if America pledged not to invade Cuba. The second, more formal and harder-edged, demanded that America also remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey as part of any deal. The differing tones suggested division within the Soviet leadership, perhaps Khrushchev being overruled by harder-line colleagues, and raised the terrifying possibility that events were spiraling beyond anyone's control. That same day brought news that made the situation even more dangerous. An American U-2 spy plane had been shot down over Cuba, its pilot, Major Rudolph Anderson, killed by a Soviet surface-to-air missile. The Joint Chiefs immediately demanded retaliation, arguing that the shooting down of an American aircraft required military response. But Kennedy resisted the pressure, recognizing that responding to the shootdown with airstrikes would likely trigger the exact escalation he was trying to avoid. He chose to ignore the second Khrushchev letter and respond only to the first, accepting the implicit offer to trade removal of missiles for a no-invasion pledge. Preventive also secretly assured Khrushchev, through back-channel negotiations conducted by Robert Kennedy, meeting with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrinin, that America would remove the Jupiter missiles from Turkey within a few months after the Cuban crisis was resolved. This had to be secret because Turkey, a NATO ally, had not been consulted and would be humiliated by such a deal. Kennedy was willing to make the concession because the Jupiter missiles were obsolete and scheduled for removal anyway. But acknowledging this publicly would appear as if America had been forced to back down. The secret deal gave Khrushchev a way to justify retreat to his own hardliners, while maintaining the public appearance that America had stood firm. Sunday morning, October 28th, brought the breakthrough. Khrushchev announced over Radio Moscow that the Soviet Union would dismantle the weapons and return them to the Soviet Union, accepting Kennedy's public terms. The Cuban Missile Crisis was over. The world stepped back from nuclear war. Humanity survived by a combination of skillful leadership, restraint under enormous pressure, and sheer luck that no accident or miscalculation triggered the catastrophe that both sides feared. The resolution of the crisis enhanced Kennedy's reputation enormously, both domestically and internationally. He had faced down the Soviet Union without starting a war, had shown firmness without recklessness, had given Khrushchev room to retreat without humiliation. The handling of the crisis demonstrated growth from the Bay of Pigs failure, showing that Kennedy had learned to question assumptions, resist pressure for immediate military action, and find diplomatic solutions even in the most dangerous circumstances. He had proven himself capable of leadership under the most extreme pressure imaginable. But the crisis also revealed how close humanity had come to annihilation, how easily accidents or misunderstandings could trigger nuclear war, how the existence of these weapons created dangers that no amount of wisdom or restraint could fully control. Kennedy emerged from the 13 days with a changed perspective on the Cold War and nuclear weapons, recognizing that competition with the Soviet Union had to be managed carefully, that communication was essential, that both superpowers shared an interest in preventing nuclear war, even as they remained ideological adversaries. In the aftermath, Kennedy pushed for practical measures to reduce the risk of future crises. A direct communication link, the hotline, was established between the White House and the Kremlin to enable instant communication during emergencies, preventing the kind of confusion and delay that had made the missile crisis so dangerous. He also pursued a treaty banning atmospheric nuclear testing, recognizing that the arms race itself created instability, and that some form of arms control was necessary if humanity was going to survive the nuclear age. The missile crisis marked Kennedy's transformation from a politician who looked presidential into a president who was presidential. From someone who had won power through charm and political skill into a leader who had proven himself capable of wielding that power wisely when the survival of civilization hung in the balance. The sickly second son, who had towed an injured sailor through shark-infested waters, had shown the same courage and determination while navigating through diplomatic waters even more treacherous, where one wrong move meant not his own death, but potentially the deaths of hundreds of millions. He had passed the ultimate test of leadership, and in passing it, he had grown into someone capable of imagining a different future, one where competition did not have to mean catastrophe, where adversaries could find common ground in their shared humanity. That vision would shape the final year of his presidency and define much of his legacy. We choose to go to the moon. Program represented something different from the usual calculations of Cold War competition, something that transcended the grim arithmetic of missiles and megatons and mutually assured destruction. For John Kennedy, the decision to go to the moon was initially tactical, a way to demonstrate American technological superiority and recover prestige lost when the Soviet Union put the first satellite and then the first human into space. But as his presidency progressed, the moon mission came to represent something larger and more important, a symbol of human potential and American ambition, proof that democracy could accomplish the impossible if it was willing to commit resources and will to a shared goal. Forging Kennedy took office in January 1961, America's space program lagged badly behind the Soviet Union's. Sputnik's launch in October 1957 had shocked Americans and triggered fears that Soviet technological superiority would translate into military advantage. Then, on April 12, 1961, Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space, orbiting the Earth in his Vostok spacecraft and returning safely. It was a spectacular achievement that made America look slow and backward, a democracy unable to match a dictatorship's accomplishments. Alan Shepard's suborbital flight on May 5, 1961, restored some American pride, but it was clearly a lesser achievement than Gagarin's full orbit, a half step rather than a leap. Kennedy immediately enough the political and psychological importance of space achievement. He consulted with Vice President Johnson, a space enthusiast who chaired the National Space Council, and with NASA Administrator James Webb and other experts, asking them what goal America could realistically achieve before the Soviets, where American advantages in resources and organization could overcome Soviet head starts. The answer they provided was both ambitious and audacious. landing a human on the moon and returning them safely to Earth. The Soviets were ahead in rocket technology and had more experience with space operations, but they did not have the economic resources or organizational capacity to sustain the kind of massive program that a moon landing would require. America did, if the nation was willing to commit to the goal. On May 26, 1961, just 3 weeks after Shepard's suborbital flight and 6 weeks after Gagarin's orbit, Kennedy stood before a joint session of Congress and committed the nation to landing a man on the moon before the decade's end. He acknowledged the enormous cost, perhaps $22 billion over the decade, and the technological challenges that had no certain solutions. He recognized that success was not guaranteed, that the goal was extraordinarily difficult and risky. But he argued that the effort was worth making, not just for strategic advantage, but because the exploration of space represented one of the great adventures of human history. And free societies should lead in this adventure, rather than follow. The speech was effective in getting congressional support for dramatically increased NASA funding, but Kennedy recognized that a larger public effort would be needed to sustain commitment over the years it would take to actually accomplish the goal. On September 12, 1962, he traveled to Rice University in Houston, where NASA's new Manned Spacecraft Center was being built, to deliver what would become one of his most famous speeches, the address in which he declared, "We choose to go to the moon." The Rice University speech was pure Kennedy, combining soaring rhetoric with concrete detail, inspiring vision with practical reality. He condensed human history into 50 years, showing how recent the greatest achievements were, how quickly progress accelerates, how what seems impossible becomes routine within a generation. He acknowledged the difficulties honestly, describing the challenges of sending a rocket to the moon and comparing the goal to climbing the highest mountain or flying the Atlantic, when those achievements seemed impossible. And then came the line that defined both the speech and the space program itself. "We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard." That single sentence captured something essential about Kennedy's vision, not just for space, but for America. The goal should be difficulty itself, the challenge of accomplishing what has never been done, the satisfaction that comes from pushing human capability beyond previous boundaries. Democracy should not shrink from competition with totalitarian systems, but should embrace that competition as proof of free society's superiority, demonstrating that people working together voluntarily can accomplish more than people driven by authoritarian force. The moon mission was Cold War competition, certainly, but it was competition that lifted humanity rather than threatening to destroy it, that pointed towards stars rather than at enemy cities. Foreground sends Kennedy's challenge with remarkable speed and effectiveness. The agency established new facilities, including the Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston that would manage human spaceflight operations, and the Kennedy Space Center in Florida that would launch the missions. It began 3 major programs: Mercury, to prove humans could survive and function in space; Gemini, to develop techniques for rendezvous and docking and extended duration flight; and Apollo, to actually reach the moon. Contractors across the nation worked on different components of the massive undertaking, from the Saturn V rocket that would launch the missions to the lunar module that would land on the moon's surface. The technical challenges were immense and sometimes seemed insurmountable. No rocket existed powerful enough to send the necessary payload to the moon. The computers needed to navigate and control the spacecraft did not exist and would have to be invented. Methods for rendezvous and docking in space, essential for the lunar mission profile, had never been tested. Heat shields capable of protecting returning astronauts from the temperatures of re-entering Earth's atmosphere at lunar return velocities had to be developed. Spacesuits that could protect humans from the moon's vacuum while allowing mobility had to be designed. Every component was pushing the boundaries of what was technologically possible, and failure at any point could doom the entire mission. The human cost of the space program became tragically apparent on January 27, 1967, when a fire during a ground test killed astronauts Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, burning them to death in their Apollo capsule while technicians struggled futilely to open the hatch. The accident revealed serious design flaws and management failures, leading to a comprehensive review and redesign of the Apollo spacecraft. But it also demonstrated the risks that astronauts accepted as the price of exploration. The reality that reaching for the moon meant some would die trying. Kennedy would not live to see whether his challenge was met. But the program he initiated continued after his death, driven by the momentum he had created and the commitment he had inspired. On July 20, 1969, Apollo 11 commander Neil Armstrong stepped from the lunar module Eagle onto the moon's surface, fulfilling Kennedy's promise with 5 months to spare before the decade ended. "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," Armstrong said. And in that moment, Kennedy's vision was vindicated. His faith in America's capacity to accomplish the impossible proven correct. Majestic represented many things: technological achievement, Cold War victory, human courage, scientific advancement. But perhaps most importantly, it represented the power of leadership to set audacious goals and inspire extraordinary effort. Kennedy had seen further than most, had recognized that aiming high produces better results than settling for the merely achievable, had understood that people respond to challenges that demand their best rather than goals that require only their adequate. The Moon program proved that democracy could organize massive undertakings, requiring sustained commitment over many years, that free societies were not condemned to short-term thinking and immediate gratification. Amendment also demonstrated Kennedy's growth as a leader. Early in his presidency, he had focused on space primarily as Cold War competition, a way to beat the Soviets and restore American prestige. But over time, his rhetoric increasingly emphasized exploration itself as worthwhile, the expansion of human knowledge and capability as its own justification, regardless of strategic advantage. He came to see the space program as representing the best of what America could be: ambitious, capable, willing to take risks for great purposes, committed to expanding human possibility rather than merely defending what already existed. When Kennedy stood at Rice University and declared that America chose to go to the moon not because it was easy, but because it was hard, he was describing not just the space program, but a philosophy of leadership and national purpose. Greatness comes from attempting the difficult, from setting goals that require the best from everyone, from refusing to accept limitations as permanent or obstacles as insurmountable. The sickly boy who had overcome constant illness, the PT boat commander who had swum 3 miles towing an injured sailor, the president who had navigated through nuclear crisis, understood in his bones that difficulty is what makes achievement meaningful. The moon landing vindicated that understanding, proved that Kennedy's faith in human potential was justified, that the impossible becomes possible when people commit to making it so. The moral issue: civil rights. Cuban Missile Crisis revealed Kennedy's capacity for leadership in foreign affairs. The civil rights movement forced him to confront the gap between his soaring rhetoric about freedom and his cautious actions to defend it at home. The transformation of John Kennedy from a politician who calculated the costs of taking strong stands on civil rights into a president who recognized those stands as moral imperatives was neither quick nor simple. It required events to push him, activists to pull him, and his own conscience to finally override his political caution. The journey from expedience to conviction was one of the most important developments of his presidency, even though it would remain unfinished at his death. Unchecked when Kennedy took office in January 1961, the civil rights movement had been building momentum for years. The Montgomery bus boycott in 1955-56 the integration of Little Rock Central High School in 1957, the sit-ins at lunch counters across the South starting in 1960, all demonstrated both the determination of Black Americans to claim their constitutional rights and the violent resistance of white supremacists determined to preserve segregation. But Kennedy's campaign had promised more than his presidency initially delivered. He had spoken eloquently about civil rights, had won strong support from Black voters, but once in office, he moved cautiously, worried about alienating Southern Democrats whose support he needed for other legislation and whose power in Congress could block his entire agenda. His first 2 years showed this caution clearly. He made symbolic appointments, naming unprecedented numbers of African Americans to government positions, including federal judgeships. He established the President's Committee on Equal Employment Opportunity to combat job discrimination. He used executive orders where he could act without congressional approval, forbidding discrimination in federal housing programs and government contracts. These were real actions that made real differences for many people, but they were also carefully limited, designed to avoid confrontations with powerful Southern senators and representatives who controlled key congressional committees. The Freedom Riders of 1961 tested Kennedy's commitment. These integrated groups of activists rode interstate buses into the Deep South, challenging segregation in bus terminals and facing brutal violence from white mobs. In Alabama, buses were burned and riders were beaten with pipes and chains, while local police stood by or participated. Kennedy sent federal marshals to protect the riders, but also pressured them privately to stop their protests, arguing that the violence was politically damaging and threatened his legislative agenda. He was more concerned with managing the crisis than supporting the cause, more focused on maintaining order than achieving justice. Asian of the University of Mississippi in 1962 forced Kennedy to take stronger action. James Meredith, a Black Air Force veteran, had been repeatedly denied admission to Ole Miss because of his race. When federal courts ordered his admission, Mississippi Governor Ross Barnett vowed to prevent it personally. Kennedy federalized the Mississippi National Guard and sent federal marshals to escort Meredith to registration, but white mobs rioted on campus, fighting marshals and burning vehicles. 2 people died in the violence. Kennedy spent a long night on the phone with officials on the ground, finally sending in army troops to restore order. Meredith registered and attended classes under federal protection. But Kennedy's public statements focused on law and order rather than moral right, emphasizing legal requirements rather than human dignity. Civil rights leaders recognized Kennedy's pattern: act when forced, but avoid leading; respond to crises, but do not initiate change; protect individuals in immediate danger, but resist comprehensive solutions. Martin Luther King Jr. and others grew frustrated with what they saw as the administration's preference for gradualism over justice, its greater concern with Southern white feelings than Black rights. The relationship between the Kennedy administration and the civil rights movement was complicated, marked by tactical cooperation mixed with fundamental disagreement about pace and priority. Bisexual in the spring of 1963 changed everything. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference, led by King and Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, launched a campaign of peaceful protests against segregation in Birmingham's businesses. The city's public safety commissioner, Eugene "Bull" Connor, responded with dogs and fire hoses, ordering police to attack peaceful protesters, including children. The images were horrific and undeniable, broadcast on television news programs and published on front pages worldwide. German shepherds tearing at protesters' clothes, high-pressure water cannons knocking people off their feet and smashing them against walls, policemen beating people who were not resisting. The violence revealed the brutality that enforced segregation, made visible the evil that polite euphemisms had hidden. Kennedy watched the Birmingham footage with horror and finally understood what civil rights leaders had been trying to tell him. This was not a political issue that could be managed with careful calibration, but a moral crisis that demanded clear moral leadership. The images from Birmingham showed him what his caution had enabled, revealed the cost of prioritizing political calculation over human rights. He recognized, perhaps for the first time in his presidency, that staying on the sidelines was itself a choice with consequences, that refusing to lead on civil rights was a form of complicity with injustice. On June 11, 1963, Kennedy faced another confrontation when Alabama Governor George Wallace physically blocked the entrance to the University of Alabama, prevent two black students, Vivian Malone and James Hood, from registering. Wallace had promised segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever in his inaugural address, and he was making good on that promise by personally defying federal authority. Kennedy federalized the Alabama National Guard, and when Guard units arrived at the university, Wallace stepped aside. But Kennedy understood that symbols and gestures were no longer sufficient, that the moral weight of the moment required him to speak directly to the American people. That evening, Kennedy delivered a televised address from the Oval Office that marked a turning point in his presidency and in the civil rights movement. The speech was largely unprepared, with Kennedy and his speechwriters finishing the draft minutes before airtime, working frantically to capture the right tone and language. What emerged was Kennedy's most morally powerful speech, the moment when he finally matched his actions to his rhetoric about freedom. Kennedy spoke of civil rights not as a constitutional issue alone, not merely as a legal question of court orders and federal authority, but as a moral issue as old as the scriptures and as clear as the Constitution. He asked white Americans to imagine themselves with different skin color, to consider whether they would accept second-class citizenship, whether they would be content with separate and inferior schools and public facilities, whether they would tolerate being denied the right to vote or eat at lunch counters. He declared that America could not preach freedom abroad while denying it at home, that the struggle for equal rights was fundamentally about whether America would live up to its founding principles. The speech announced Kennedy's intention to propose comprehensive civil rights legislation that would guarantee all Americans equal access to public accommodations, end segregation in schools, protect voting rights, and provide the federal government with enforcement powers to ensure compliance. It was the strongest commitment to civil rights by any president since Abraham Lincoln, a recognition that leadership meant taking stands even when politically costly, that some issues transcend tactical calculation and demand moral clarity. Hours after Kennedy's speech, NAACP leader Medgar Evers was murdered in front of his home in Jackson, Mississippi, shot in the back by a white supremacist. The assassination underscored both the urgency of Kennedy's commitment and the violent resistance it would face. But Kennedy did not retreat, instead pushing forward with the civil rights legislation he had promised, working with congressional leaders to build support and counter opposition. The March on Washington, on August 28, 1963, brought more than 250,000 people to the nation's capital in the largest demonstration for civil rights in American history. Kennedy had initially opposed the march, worried that it might antagonize Congress and doom his legislation, but he ultimately embraced it and met with civil rights leaders afterward. King's "I Have a Dream" speech from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial articulated the moral vision that Kennedy had belatedly come to share, the understanding that America would never be complete until all Americans were free. The Civil Rights Bill that Kennedy proposed in the summer of 1963 was comprehensive and strong, forbidding discrimination in employment and public accommodations, giving the Justice Department power to file school desegregation lawsuits, authorizing federal withdrawal of funds from programs practicing discrimination. Southern Democrats in Congress vowed to block it through filibuster, and Kennedy knew the fight would be long and difficult. He used every tool at his disposal to build support, meeting with business leaders and religious groups, making the case that civil rights was both morally right and economically sound. arguing that America could not claim leadership of the free world while maintaining systems of racial oppression at home. By November 1963, the legislation was stalled in Congress, caught in committee, and facing determined opposition. Kennedy was optimistic about eventually passing it, but recognized that success would require sustained effort over many months. In his last press conference on November 14th, he spoke of civil rights with a literary reference, quoting Arthur Hugh Clough. "However dark the land looks now, I think that westward look the land is bright, and I think that next summer it may be." He would not live to see that summer, would not witness the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that President Johnson would sign in his memory. Kennedy's evolution on civil rights revealed both his weaknesses and his capacity for growth. He had been too cautious for too long, more concerned with political consequences than moral imperatives, willing to settle for incremental progress when justice demanded immediate action. But he had learned, had allowed events and activists to teach him, had finally recognized that leadership sometimes means taking risks for principles that transcend self-interest. The transformation was incomplete, the legislative battle unfinished, but the direction was clear. The president who had prioritized political calculation had become the president who declared civil rights a moral issue and staked his political capital on achieving it. It was perhaps his most important growth as a leader, even if the consequences would be realized only after his death. Dallas, November 22, 1963. The presidential trip to Texas in late November 1963 was political necessity disguised as official business. Kennedy needed Texas for re-election in 1964, and Texas Democrats were feuding among themselves in ways that threatened to cost him the state he had barely won in 1960. Vice President Johnson and Governor John Connally represented different factions of the party, and their rivalry was undermining Democratic unity. Kennedy's visit was designed to heal those divisions, raise money, and show strength heading into what would be a difficult re-election campaign. He would visit San Antonio, Houston, Fort Worth, Dallas, and Austin, giving speeches and attending fundraising events, attempting to unite a fractured state party behind his leadership. The trip began on Thursday, November 21st, with stops in San Antonio and Houston that went well. Large crowds turned out, enthusiastic and welcoming, the kind of reception that reminded Kennedy why he loved campaigning despite its exhaustions. That evening, after arriving in Fort Worth, Kennedy gave a brief speech to supporters gathered outside his hotel in the rain, thanking them for their dedication and promising to fight for them in Washington. The next morning, he spoke at a Fort Worth Chamber of Commerce breakfast, discussing military preparedness and the need for continued vigilance against communist threats. Everything seemed routine, just another day of political work in a career built on such days. Air Force One landed at Dallas Love Field shortly before noon on Friday, November 22nd. Kennedy and the First Lady emerged into bright Texas sunshine, greeted by Governor and Mrs. Connally and a crowd of well-wishers at the airport. Jackie wore a pink Chanel suit with a matching pillbox hat, the kind of elegant outfit that had made her a fashion icon. The president looked relaxed and vigorous, shaking hands along the airport fence, connecting with people as he had done thousands of times before. Nothing in that moment suggested what was coming, no premonition of the horror that would unfold within the hour. The motorcade left Love Field at 11:50 a.m., proceeding through downtown Dallas toward the Trade Mart, where Kennedy was scheduled to speak at a luncheon. The President and First Lady rode in the back seat of the presidential limousine, a specially modified Lincoln Continental. Governor Connally and his wife Nellie occupied the jump seats ahead of them. Secret Service agents rode in the follow-up car behind. The bubble top on the limousine was down, despite security concerns, because Kennedy wanted the people to see him and he wanted to see them. The route took them down Main Street through cheering crowds, then onto Houston Street, then a slow left turn onto Elm Street as they entered Dealey Plaza. At 12:30 p.m., As the motorcade passed the Texas School Book Depository building, shots were fired. The first bullet struck Kennedy in the upper back, exiting through his throat. Governor Connolly was also hit, sustaining serious wounds to his back, chest, wrist, and thigh. The president clutched at his throat, and Jackie turned toward him. Then came the final shot, striking Kennedy in the head. The impact was devastating. Jacqueline Kennedy reached toward her husband, then crawled onto the back of the moving car, reaching for something, later saying she had no memory of what she was doing. Secret Service agent Clint Hill leaped onto the car, pushing her back into her seat as the limousine accelerated toward Parkland Memorial Hospital. What followed were minutes that stretched into agonized eternity. Doctors at Parkland worked desperately to save the president, but the wound was unsurvivable. At 1 p.m. Central Time, President John Fitzgerald Kennedy was pronounced dead. He was 46 years old and had been president for 1,036 days. In a small room at the hospital, Jacqueline Kennedy stood beside her husband's body, her suit still stained with his blood, refusing to change clothes because she wanted the world to see what had been done. Vice President Johnson, who had been 2 cars behind Kennedy in the motorcade and was uninjured, was rushed to Air Force One at Love Field. Federal law required an immediate transfer of presidential authority, and Johnson was sworn in as the 36th president aboard the airplane at 2:38 p.m., with Jacqueline Kennedy standing beside him, still wearing the blood-stained suit. The oath was administered by federal judge Sarah Hughes, making her the first woman to swear in a president. Minutes later, Air Force One departed Dallas, carrying Johnson to assume the presidency and Kennedy's body home to Washington. Western hours, Dallas police 4-year-old employee of the Texas School Book Depository. Oswald had a complicated history. Former Marine, defector to the Soviet Union who had returned to the United States, pro-Castro activist with mysterious connections and unclear motivations. He was charged with murdering President Kennedy and Dallas police officer J.D. Tippit, who had been shot shortly after the assassination. Oswald denied guilt, claiming he was a patsy, but evidence linking him to the crime seemed strong. 2 days later, on Sunday morning, November 24th, as police prepared to transfer Oswald from city jail to county jail, a Dallas nightclub owner named Jack Ruby pushed through the crowd of reporters and police officers and shot Oswald at point-blank range on live television. Millions of Americans watched in real time as Oswald crumpled to the ground, fatally wounded. He died at Parkland Hospital, the same hospital where Kennedy had died 2 days earlier. Ruby's motive remained unclear, though he claimed grief over Kennedy's death and a desire to spare Jackie Kennedy the ordeal of a trial. The shooting eliminated the possibility of Oswald standing trial and answering questions about his actions and motivations. President Kennedy's funeral took place on Monday, November 25th, a day of national mourning. The flag-draped casket was carried from the White House to the Capitol, where it lay in state as hundreds of thousands of Americans filed past to pay respects. Then came the funeral procession to St. Matthew's Cathedral for a requiem mass, followed by burial at Arlington National Cemetery. Leaders from more than 90 nations attended, including Charles de Gaulle of France, Haile Selassie of Ethiopia, and representatives from the Soviet Union. The funeral was broadcast live on television, watched by millions around the world, who mourned the loss of a leader who had inspired hope. The images from that day remain seared into American memory. John Kennedy Jr., 3 years old on the day of his father's funeral, saluting as the casket passed. Jackie Kennedy, veiled and composed, maintaining dignity through unimaginable grief. The riderless black horse with boots reversed in the stirrups, the traditional military symbol of a fallen leader. The eternal flame that Jackie lit at the gravesite, burning continuously as a reminder of all that was lost and all that had been promised. President Johnson established the Warren Commission to investigate the assassination, headed by Chief Justice Earl Warren. The commission's report, issued in September 1964, concluded that Oswald had acted alone in killing Kennedy, that there was no evidence of conspiracy either domestic or international. But the conclusions failed to satisfy many Americans, and questions about the assassination would persist for decades. The abruptness of Kennedy's death, the murder of Oswald before he could stand trial, the complexity of events and motivations, all created conditions where conspiracy theories could flourish. The assassination of John Kennedy was not the first presidential murder in American history, but it was the first captured on film and broadcast to the world through television. It became a shared national trauma, a moment when innocence died and certainty was replaced by doubt. When the future that had seemed bright and full of possibility was suddenly darkened by violence that made no sense. For millions of Americans, the memory of where they were when they heard Kennedy was dead would remain vivid for their entire lives, a defining moment that divided time into before and after. For all the questions about who killed Kennedy and why, one truth was undeniable. The youngest elected president was dead, killed by an assassin in broad daylight while riding through an American city greeting crowds. The vigor and charm and promise that had seemed to define a new era were extinguished in seconds. The unfinished presidency would never be completed, the vision only partially realized, the potential only partially fulfilled. What might have been would remain forever unknown, leaving historians to debate and Americans to wonder what would have happened if the shots had missed. If Kennedy had lived to complete his first term and potentially win a second, if the trajectory he had begun to follow had not been violently interrupted. The legend. An unfinished life. John Kennedy served as president for 1,036 days, just under 3 years, his administration cut short before it could fully mature or reveal its ultimate direction. This brevity makes assessment difficult and, inevitably, speculative. What Kennedy accomplished must be weighed against what he intended to accomplish, what he began against what he never had the chance to finish, the promise against the reality. The legend that grew after his death sometimes obscured the complexity of the man and the limitations of his achievements, but it also captured something real about the hope he inspired and the possibilities he represented. Kennedy's legislative record was modest, particularly on domestic policy. His proposals for federal aid to education, Medicare, and civil rights made little progress through Congress during his lifetime. Southern Democrats and conservative Republicans blocked much of his agenda, and Kennedy lacked either the votes or the political skill to overcome their resistance. Only after his death, when President Johnson invoked Kennedy's memory and used his own superior understanding of congressional politics, did many of Kennedy's proposals become law. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, perhaps the most important domestic legislation of the decade, was Kennedy's proposal but Johnson's achievement, passed through a combination of moral pressure from the civil rights movement and political maneuvering that Kennedy had not mastered. Confiscated, Kennedy's record was more substantial but still mixed. The Bay of Pigs invasion was an unmitigated disaster that damaged American prestige and strengthened Castro. The handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis, by contrast, demonstrated skillful leadership under the most extreme pressure, bringing the world back from the brink of nuclear war through careful calibration of firmness and restraint. The Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, signed in 1963, was a significant achievement, the first arms control agreement of the nuclear age and a step toward reducing Cold War tensions. But Kennedy also deepened American involvement in Vietnam, increasing the number of military advisors from hundreds when he took office to 16,000 by the time of his death, laying groundwork for the catastrophic escalation that would follow under Johnson. The space program was Kennedy's most visible success, though he would not live to see its culmination. His commitment to landing on the moon before the decade ended created momentum that survived his death, and the achievement in 1969 vindicated his faith in American capability and determination. The Peace Corps, established by executive order in his first months and made permanent by Congress, proved to be an enduring institution that embodied his vision of public service. Both programs demonstrated that Kennedy's greatest skill might have been in inspiring large efforts toward ambitious goals, in making the difficult seem achievable through the power of rhetoric and the force of commitment. Where Kennedy changed most dramatically during his presidency was in his thinking about the Cold War and the possibility of peace. Early in his term, he spoke in militant terms about paying any price and bearing any burden to ensure the survival of liberty, rhetoric that assumed permanent confrontation between democracy and communism. But the Cuban Missile Crisis, which brought him face to face with the reality of nuclear war, fundamentally altered his perspective. In June 1963, he gave a commencement address at American University that marked a shift in Cold War rhetoric, speaking of peace not as the absence of conflict, but as a positive value worth pursuing, arguing that America and the Soviet Union shared common interests despite ideological differences. The American University speech suggested Kennedy was evolving toward a more nuanced understanding of international relations, recognizing that coexistence with the Soviet Union was preferable to destruction of both societies, that competition need not mean confrontation, that peace was possible even between adversaries. Whether this evolution would have led to fundamental changes in policy, particularly regarding Vietnam, remains one of the great what-ifs of history. Some evidence suggests Kennedy was considering withdrawal from Vietnam, but other evidence shows he was committed to preventing communist victory there. The question of what Kennedy would have done about Vietnam had he lived has generated endless debate, but no conclusive answer. On civil rights, Kennedy's evolution was clearer, but also incomplete. He moved from political caution to moral commitment, from calculating costs to recognizing imperatives, from managing crises to attempting to solve them. His June 1963 civil rights address marked a genuine transformation in how he understood the issue, but the transformation came late and left crucial work unfinished. He proposed strong legislation, but did not live to fight for its passage. He spoke eloquently about justice, but still prioritized political considerations in ways that frustrated activists. The trajectory was toward greater courage, but the journey had only begun when his life ended. Blankett's Kennedy's greatest legacy was less about specific policies or achievements, and more about inspiring a generation to believe in public service and national purpose. His inaugural call to ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country, resonated with millions of young Americans who joined the Peace Corps, entered politics, became activists for various causes. He made politics seem heroic rather than sordid, made government service appear noble rather than bureaucratic, made idealism respectable in an age that might otherwise have settled for cynicism. Whether this inspiration survived the disillusionment that followed, the Vietnam War and Watergate and assassinations, remains debatable. But for a time, Kennedy made many Americans believe their country could be better than it was. The Camelot mythology that grew after Kennedy's death, encouraged by Jackie Kennedy's interviews and the efforts of Kennedy loyalists, created an image of the Kennedy years as a golden age of elegance and possibility. The reality was more complicated and less romantic than the myth suggested. Kennedy had serious health problems that he hid from the public, chronic pain that required constant medication, including amphetamines and steroids. He had extramarital affairs that, if known at the time, would have scandalized the nation. He was sometimes reckless in ways that put his presidency at risk. The image of vigor and health was carefully managed performance, real in some ways but manufactured in others. Yet stripping away the mythology does not eliminate the substance. Kennedy grew in office, learned from failures, evolved in his thinking about crucial issues. He faced genuine crises and handled most of them well, demonstrating leadership capacity that exceeded what critics had predicted. He inspired genuine hope in millions of people around the world who saw in him the possibility of a different future, a world where young leaders could address old problems with fresh thinking. He raised expectations for what politics could be, what leaders should aspire to, what nations might accomplish when they committed to ambitious goals. The assessment of Kennedy's presidency ultimately depends on what standard is applied. Measured against his own promises and aspirations, his accomplishments fall short. Measured against the achievements of other presidents in similar circumstances, his record is respectable, but not exceptional. Measured by his impact on American culture and political consciousness, his significance is enormous. He changed how Americans thought about their presidents, expecting them to be articulate and sophisticated and engaged with ideas. He changed how politics was conducted, making television and image central in ways they had not been before. He changed what was considered possible, pushing Americans to aim higher than circumstances seemed to allow. The unfinished life leaves us with questions that cannot be answered definitively. Would Kennedy have withdrawn from Vietnam or escalated involvement? Would he have achieved major civil rights legislation or seen his proposals blocked? Would he have won re-election in 1964 and served a second term? Would he have been remembered as a great president or merely a charismatic one? The assassination froze Kennedy in time, preventing both the failures that might have diminished his reputation and the achievements that might have enhanced it. We are left with promise rather than fulfillment, potential rather than realization, the dream rather than the reality. Kennedy mattered, that his presidency made a difference even in its brevity, that his death shaped American history in ways both obvious and subtle. He was not a perfect leader or an unblemished hero, but he was a man who grew into his responsibilities, who learned from mistakes, who inspired others to believe in the possibility of progress. That is perhaps legacy enough for any president, and more than most achieve. The torch he spoke of in his inaugural address was indeed passed to a new generation, and though he could not carry it as far as he intended, he carried it far enough to light the way for others to follow. The torch still burns. Return to that November afternoon in Dallas, to the moment when the impossible became real, when shots rang out and a presidency ended and a nation's future was altered in ways large and small. The motorcade speeds toward Parkland Hospital, but already it is too late. Already the course of history has changed. In hospitals and offices and homes across America and around the world, people will soon hear the news and stop what they are doing, united in shock and grief and disbelief that such a thing could happen, that violence could reach even the most powerful office in the most powerful nation. But focus not on what was lost in that moment, tragic as it was, but on what survived. The words Kennedy spoke did not die with him. The vision he articulated remained, to inspire those who heard it. The challenge he issued to his generation and to all generations that would follow, to serve, to sacrifice, to strive toward a better future. That challenge did not end when his life did. The torch, as he said, had been passed, and though he could not carry it as far as he hoped, others would pick it up and carry it forward. Consider what Kennedy's life demonstrated about the possibility of growth and change. The sickly second son became a war hero. The reluctant politician became a president. The cautious calculator on civil rights became the advocate for justice. The Cold War hawk, who spoke of paying any price, became the leader who stepped back from nuclear confrontation and spoke of peace as more than the absence of war. In every phase of his life, Kennedy was more than he seemed, capable of more than others expected, growing towards something better than what he was. The lessons from his life remain relevant decades after his death. Leadership requires courage, but also restraint, knowing when to stand firm and when to seek compromise. Power should be pursued not for its own sake, but for the opportunity it provides to accomplish meaningful goals. Crisis reveals character, showing whether leaders will rise to challenges or be overwhelmed by them. And perhaps most importantly, each generation must take responsibility for the world it inherits, working to solve problems rather than merely complaining about them. Kennedy understood something essential about human nature and democratic society. People respond to challenges that demand their best. The moon landing succeeded not in spite of its difficulty, but because of it, mobilizing talent and resources precisely because the goal seemed impossible. The Peace Corps attracted volunteers because it offered meaningful service, the chance to make a difference through personal sacrifice. Civil rights activism gained momentum because it appealed to the best in people, asking them to recognize shared humanity across the barriers of race and prejudice. In each case, the call was to difficulty and sacrifice, and in each case, people answered that call. We still answer Kennedy's call, whether we know it or not. Every person who chooses public service over private gain, every volunteer who travels to foreign lands to help strangers, every activist who fights for justice against long odds, every leader who speaks truth when silence would be safer. They are answering the challenge Kennedy issued in his inaugural address. The work he began remains unfinished, as all important work remains unfinished, each generation inheriting problems from the previous and bequeathing problems to the next. The civil rights he belatedly championed are still being fought for, the struggle for equality and justice continuing in new forms against new obstacles. The peace he sought still eludes us, conflicts erupting across the globe for reasons both old and new. The exploration of space he championed continues, though the moon is no longer the frontier, but rather a waypoint toward more distant goals. The democracy he defended faces new challenges, from authoritarian resurgence and technological disruption and social fragmentation. Nothing is finished, nothing is settled, nothing is guaranteed. But that is precisely the point Kennedy was making. The work of freedom is never complete, because freedom itself must be earned by each generation, defended against new threats, expanded to include those previously excluded, reimagined to meet changing circumstances. There is no final victory, no point at which we can declare democracy secure and freedom universal and justice achieved. There is only the ongoing struggle, the continuous effort, the eternal commitment to make the world better than we found it. Kennedy's famous words from his inaugural address endure not because they are beautiful, though they are, but because they are true. Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Ask not because your country deserves your service, but because you deserve the opportunity to serve something larger than yourself, to be part of something meaningful, to contribute to a future you will not live to see fully realized. The greatest satisfaction in life comes not from what we take, but from what we give. Not from what we consume, but from what we create. Not from what we demand, but from what we offer. The torch Kennedy spoke of still burns, passed from his hands to ours, from his generation to ours, burning with the same idealism and the same challenge. What will we do with it? Will we carry it forward or let it fall? Will we answer the call to service or ignore it? Will we face the difficult challenges of our time with courage or retreat into comfort? Will we believe in the possibility of progress or surrender to cynicism? Kennedy believed that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when inspired by leaders who believed in them and challenged them and showed them what was possible. He believed that democracy, for all its flaws and frustrations, represented humanity's best hope for organizing society in ways that respected human dignity and enabled human potential. He believed that America, despite its failures and contradictions, could be a force for good in the world, not through domination, but through example, not through coercion, but through inspiration. Those beliefs were tested by events, complicated by reality, challenged by critics then and now, but they were not disproven. The moon landing proved that impossible goals could be achieved through commitment and effort. The Civil Rights Act proved that moral wrongs could be corrected when enough people demanded justice. The end of the Cold War, years after Kennedy's death, proved that adversaries could find common ground and that peace was possible even between hostile ideologies. In each case, the pessimists were proven wrong and the idealists vindicated. We need that vindication again today. Need the reminder that progress is possible even when circumstances seem dark. That leadership matters even in times of cynicism. That ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they choose to act. Kennedy's life reminds us that heroes are not born but made, forged through struggle and failure and persistence. The sickly boy became the vigorous leader. The second son exceeded the first. The politician became the statesman. The transformation was neither easy nor inevitable, but it was real. As we remember John Fitzgerald Kennedy on this day and every day, let us remember not just the man, but the message. Not just the president, but the principles. Not just what he accomplished, but what he challenged us to accomplish. Let us remember that leadership is about more than holding office, that service is about more than receiving credit, that patriotism is about more than flags and slogans. Let us remember that the work of freedom is never finished, that every generation must earn its place in history through the choices it makes and the causes it champions. The eternal flame at Arlington burns day and night, rain or shine, winter and summer, a physical manifestation of memory and commitment. But the true flame is not at a cemetery in Virginia, but in the hearts of everyone who heard Kennedy's words and felt their truth. Everyone who believes that the future can be better than the past. Everyone who chooses service over selfishness. That flame is passed from generation to generation, from those who fought in World War II to those who will face challenges we cannot yet imagine. Kennedy held the torch for 1,036 days. It was not long enough to finish the work he started, but it was long enough to show us the way forward. Now, the torch is in our hands. What will we do with it? How will we answer the call? What legacy will we leave for those who come after us? These questions cannot be avoided or delegated. They demand answers from each of us, in our own lives and our own time. The young president who promised to defend freedom in its hour of maximum danger is gone. But the freedom he defended remains to be defended by each generation. The vigorous leader who asked us to bear any burden and pay any price has paid the ultimate price himself, but the challenge he issued remains to be answered. The man who believed in us, who thought we were capable of reaching the moon and achieving justice and building a better world, is no longer here to lead us. But his belief in what we could become, that belief lives on in everyone who refuses to surrender to cynicism or despair. John Fitzgerald Kennedy was not perfect. He was not a saint or a savior. He was a man, flawed and complex, who tried to do something meaningful with the power he had and the time he was given. He succeeded in some things and failed in others. He grew and learned and changed. He inspired millions and disappointed some. He lived, he led, and he died, leaving behind an unfinished life and an unfinished presidency. But he also left behind a challenge that remains as urgent today as when he first issued it. To do what we can, with what we have, in the time we are given, to make the world better than we found it. The torch is passed. The flame still burns. The challenge still stands. Will we answer it? Can we answer it? The only way to know is to try, to act, to serve, to believe that our efforts matter even when success is uncertain. That is what Kennedy believed. That is what he demonstrated in his life. And that is what he calls us to do with ours. The story does not end on November 22nd, 1963. It continues in every person who chooses to serve, in every act of courage, in every stand for justice, in every moment when someone decides that cynicism is not enough and that hope is worth fighting for. The story continues in you, in your choices, in what you do with the freedom that others have defended and the opportunities that others have created. The unfinished life becomes our life to complete. The unfinished work becomes our work to continue. The torch, once carried by John Fitzgerald Kennedy, is now ours to carry forward. Do not mourn what might have been. Celebrate what was, learn from what happened, and commit to what can be. The vision that died in Dallas lives on in everyone who believes in it. The promise that was cut short endures in everyone who works to fulfill it. The dream deferred is not a dream denied, but a dream waiting for us to make it real. Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. The challenge remains. The torch burns. The future waits. What will you do?